O's sun arrived like a drum roll, spilling gold over Banana Island and setting the Obiagu estate ablaze with a brightness that made everything, crystals, chrome, human ambition, glitter like a promise that could not be kept. By 7, the gates had already become a theater of arrivals. A convoy of black SUVs hummed in formation, their engines purring with the smugness of wealth, while Okada riders gathered across the road at a safe, curious distance, pointing and shaking their heads at the spectacle. Aso ebi in emerald silk rippled like a living forest, each time a breeze wandered in from 5 Cowries Creek. Inside, the central hall rose cathedral high, a ballroom of mirrors and hush. Italian chandeliers cascaded from the ceiling like captured waterfalls, their prisms catching every stray sunbeam. The air was perfumed with imported Ecuadorian roses, petaled abundance tucked into vases as tall as children. The flowers were a statement, the kind that spoke in flawless English and unblinking zeros. Security men moved in clean arcs, earpieces pressed like secrets against their cheeks, hands hovering near hips where authority slept. Metal detectors gleamed quietly at the private entrance. The marble floors, creamy, expensive, cruel, reflected everyone as if the ground itself judged them worthy or not. "Now the wedding of the year be this," one caterer whispered to another as they hoisted trays of peppered snails into the industrial kitchen. "No be ordinary money, oh." The other nodded, eyes wide. "Ah, Obiagu money get wings." The generators throbbed at the rear like a steady heartbeat, because PHCN had already tried to embarrass dignity before dawn. Madame Obiagu, who did not recognize the concept of surrender, had simply ordered a second generator rolled in. "Light must not blink," she'd said, her tone the kind that made young men straighten their backs. Guests began to float through the halls, commissioners with the long, smooth hands of men who signed checks, tech founders with clean sneakers peeking under native wear, senators with eyes that measured favors as if they were land. The whispers moved as a current. Chike Obiagu, the groom, the one who turned a modest oil servicing contract into a hydra of logistics, vessels, pipelines, and terminals. He was the story parents told their children to explain how ambition could be dressed in agbada and still be dangerous. He was 37, and depending on who was speaking, either a genius who read balance sheets like scripture, or a man who learned very early to hold the knife by the handle and the world by the throat. "Chike no de play," someone murmured, a note of respect and a little fear sliding into the syllables. His fiancée, Amara Nwosu, arrived on every whisper with the perfume of pedigree. Daughter of Honorable Justice M. Nwosu, the quiet man, whose courtroom was a cathedral of consequence, the girl with the bright law school photographs and the soft, stubborn smile that made even tabloids go gentle for a second. She was the part of the union that made it feel inevitable, like history clearing its throat to say, "This is how dynasties are made." Perfect match, people said, by which they meant all the doors will open now, quietly, forever. In the bridal suite, high above the humming house, Amara sat before a mirror that had seen the faces of politicians and divorcees and red-eyed singers. The makeup artist worked in strokes of patience, smoothing foundation across skin that needed none. A soft lace robe fell around her frame like a friendly cloud. She smiled when anyone entered, a small, practiced curve that announced calm, but the mirror understood what other people did not. In the glass, her eyes were a pond troubled by wind. The universe hissed gently in her ears. Is this love or merely architecture? The question had lived with her for months, a house guest she fed and argued with and could never eject. She remembered the first time she walked through Chike's Lagos Island office, the respectful way employees bowed their heads like worshippers, and the way his hand sat on the small of her back as if he were showing her off, as if she were a painting he had commissioned. He had been generous, unfailingly so. Tuition funds for her cousin, hospital bills for an aunt, an entire church roof replaced in her father's village like a miracle performed in daylight. And still, in the clefts of his kindness, there were cliffs. The blogs called the event the union of power and perfection, and their headlines crackled on her phone with the impatience of hungry birds. One even called her Lagos Grace Kelly. She read them while the stylist fixed a gel that would make older women whisper, "God, when?" under their breath, and younger women pretend to be uninterested. Every ring light loved her, every photographer understood her good side. But beneath the shimmer of all those words, she felt the trapdoor of doubt. "Is it love?" she asked the quiet of the room. "Or is it relief? The relief of a family sleeping at night because bills and shame cannot find our address anymore?" No one answered. The air conditioner sighed, overworking because the sun had decided to be rude. The first letter had arrived 2 months ago, slipped under her apartment door on a Tuesday that smelled of rain. A plain envelope, no stamp, her name written in the careful tense of someone who didn't want to alarm a thing that could run. "Do not marry Chike." The second arrived like an echo in a different hand, words tilting to the right as if the writer were in a hurry. "You don't know him." The third letter did not bother with courtesy. Its ink bit the paper. "Walk away while you still can." The letters felt like someone tapping her on the shoulder in a crowded market and then disappearing into cloth and voices. She told herself that envy had finally grown legs and learned how to write. She told herself that a woman marrying a wealthy man is a road paved with anonymous advice. But some nights she woke with the taste of alarm in her mouth and the sensation that a door elsewhere had opened without sound. She began to reply in the only space that was hers, the diary with faded flowers, a relic from university days when dreams were cheaper. Words unspooled there in a hand that had learned to be cautious with hearts but not with grammar. "I do not know if I love him," she wrote. "I know he is kind to my mother, attentive to my father, a city unto himself. But when he looks at me, I sometimes feel like a new wing in his house." She paused, listening to the room for judgment, then continued. "The letters, whoever is writing them, are embers landing on dry grass inside me. If I call off the wedding, my family will drown in disgrace. If I go ahead, will I drown in something else?" She closed the diary and placed it under a pile of fabric samples, like a secret tucked into a seam. Somewhere far below, a band rehearsed. Talking drums rolled their shoulders, saxophones flirted with the ceiling. Chike, meanwhile, moved through his own corridors like a king trying not to remember he was also a son. He wore white that morning for the pre-ceremony rites, agbada heavy with gold thread that caught the sun like a friend. Men clasped his hands and laughed like steel meeting steel. "Odogwu," someone hailed, and he smiled, a small, sharp thing. He thought he understood the assignment of life, to make everything unbreakable, to make the future a machine that obeyed. He thought love was a branch that would bend beneath the weight of provision. Yet sometimes, when he looked at her, he felt the space between them the way an engineer feels the stress on a bridge. He hated that feeling. He resented it the way a man resents any variable not of his design. The house grew louder as noon approached. Aunties arrived with laughter that could cut yam, their wrists jangling with gold. Cousins compared nails. 2 bloggers snuck a selfie by the fountain and were politely escorted back to the designated media area by men who did not smile. The kitchens steamed with jollof, its red brightness catching the light like a flag. Plantains fried and turned the room into a memory of childhood. A goat stew bubbled its stubborn way into readiness. A priest walked the edge of the garden alone for a moment, beneath tulle-draped arches, his lips moving in a conversation with God about spectacle and truth. "Heaven knows," he whispered, "but Lagos insists." What threatened to be perfection revealed its hairline cracks. A bridesmaid lost an earring and blamed a makeup artist. A flower girl began to cry because someone stepped on the hem of her tiny dress. A groomsman argued with a vendor about a car that wasn't where a car should be. Madame Obiagu handled each thing with the ferocity of a general who knows she is one slip from being meme fodder. "No embarrassment," she told an event planner who trembled hard enough to rattle a pin. "If there is a problem, you will baptize it with a solution. Do you hear?" The woman nodded so vigorously, her gel bowed, and Amara, gliding through fittings and photographs and approvals, kept a private weather inside her chest, a late harmattan that refused to leave. She smiled in the exact places where a good girl is supposed to smile, said thank you to every compliment, as if the words were currency she could not afford to spend recklessly. She thought of her father's hands, the way they had trembled slightly when he placed her mother's wedding ring on her palm last week. "Marriage," he had said, voice gone grave, "is not an applause meter." It is a vow. She had looked at the ring then, simple, enduring, and wondered how a circle can feel like a cage and a shelter at the same time. Evening rehearsals gave way to logistics meetings, and logistics gave way to silence. Night crawled in, and with it, a brief blackout. The chandeliers blinked as if offended, then the generators surged and the light returned, stronger, angrier, as though daring darkness to try again. "Nepa don do their own," a steward muttered, and a ripple of laughter moved through the staff like relief. Somewhere, the band struck the first polite notes of high life. Somewhere else, a journalist drafted a headline and then deleted it because it felt too breathless. When midnight laid its clean sheet over the house, the estate exhaled. The halls emptied. The roses stood in their plump masses, pretending not to notice that flowers bruise too. In the bridal suite, Amara sat alone again and opened her diary, pages a quiet lake. She wrote without editing herself, because only paper keeps faith with the mess we hide. "If I run, I will be called selfish. If I stay, I might drown in silk. What if love is supposed to feel like risk, not relief?" She paused, then underlined the next sentence. "I want to choose my own life and not wake up in a story someone else wrote for me." She closed the diary and placed it where the morning would find it, if morning wanted to be honest. She stood by the window and looked at Lagos, that great restless animal, and listened to its belly rumble with traffic far away. "Chukwu Gazi M," she whispered. "Help me." Morning arrived, not on tiptoe, but with the feet of dancers. Phones buzzed, doors opened, fabric swished. The makeup artist returned with a smile wide enough to balance a tray. Bridesmaids poured in like perfume, bright, affectionate, hungry for photographs. "It is today, oh," one sang. The room filled with soft chaos, with steam and laughter, with the choreography of 100 small urgencies converging on one woman's face. But when the stylist knocked on the bathroom door for the third time, and the air answered with nothing but its own patience, the music inside the room changed its key. "Madam," the planner called, knocking again. Amara?" The name fell heavy, and then heavier still. They tried the closet. They checked the terrace. They checked under the silly instinct of panic. The dress waited on its mannequin, a patient bride. The diary lay open on the table, a sentence underlined like a road she meant to take. On the morning of the wedding, with the chandeliers glittering and the priests already vested, Amara Nwosu was nowhere in the estate. No note beyond a diary's whisper, no trace beyond a door left slightly ajar, just the hollow certainty that the bride had vanished without a sound. The groom stood before the mirror, draped in his gold-threaded agbada, unaware that the ground beneath him had already cracked. The tailor had promised the fabric was woven in Dubai, a silk so heavy with embroidery it seemed like gold itself had bent to serve him. The mirror threw his image back with an arrogance he had grown used to. Tall, broad-shouldered, a jaw carved with certainty, his cap sitting at a proud angle. He adjusted his cufflinks, custom diamonds cut into the Obiagu crest, and for a moment he allowed himself the private satisfaction of a man who had bent destiny until it bowed. The world outside his dressing room already hummed with restless ceremony, flutes warming up, camera shutters rehearsing their greed. But Chike Obiagu smiled faintly, confident that he was about to bind his empire to permanence. What he did not know was that history had already decided to humiliate him. The first wave of alarm came soft, like a stone dropped in a pond. A bridesmaid arrived at the groom's quarters, her makeup smudged by panic, whispering that the bride was taking too long to get dressed. At first it was dismissed. "Amara is a perfectionist," Chike said with a confidence meant to be reassuring. "She will appear like the queen she is." But when the minutes stacked upon one another like rude guests who refused to leave, when the stylist confessed that Amara had not answered from behind the bathroom door, when the planner's voice broke as she admitted the suite was empty, then the pond turned into an ocean. The announcement rippled into the hall with a violence that no microphone required. The chandeliers glittered like cruel spectators as dignitaries froze mid-conversation. A senator's wife dropped her champagne flute. The glass cracked against the marble like a gunshot. The band stopped. The MC tried to improvise, his voice trembling over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please let us maintain decorum, eh? Small delay, you know women in makeup." But the whispers moved faster than his pleas. The bride has disappeared. Chike stepped into the hall then, expecting applause. What greeted him was silence that tasted of pity. His eyes searched instinctively for Amara's white gown, the swirl of lace that should have been the center of gravity, but found only faces turned toward him in disbelief. Then the words fell on him like a sentence. "She is not here." For the first time in his empire-building life, Chike Obiagu trembled. His hand, which had signed contracts worth billions without shaking, now quivered against the heavy embroidery of his agbada. His mind, trained to calculate pipelines, routes, and risks, could not comprehend the mathematics of absence. It was as if someone had removed the final pillar from a cathedral just as the bells were about to ring. Phones came alive. Guests ducked their heads, thumbs typing furiously. Breaking: Obiagu bride missing. Exclusive: Billionaire humiliated at altar. The words were born before the police even arrived. Chike barked orders. "Find her! Lock the gates! Search every corner of the estate!" But his voice cracked, and that crack became its own rumor. The police came with hurried salutes and the heavy smell of sweat. They asked questions in tones too casual for his liking. Did she leave any note? Any signs of forced entry? Their pens scratched against cheap notebooks, as though this were a petty theft in Yaba market. Chike seethed, his pride wounded that officers in ill-fitted uniforms stood in the ballroom that had cost him 10 million naira to decorate. Rumors bloomed, poisonous and fast. Some whispered she'd been kidnapped, enemies of Chike striking where it hurt most. Others murmured that Amara had run away, that she had always looked too quiet, too thoughtful, like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, measuring the drop. One guest chuckled bitterly into his palm and muttered, "Odogwu don't collect breakfast," a phrase that spread among younger men like wildfire. Hidden jealousy surfaced easily, competitors who had always envied his empire, socialites who secretly wished to see him cut down, cousins who felt overshadowed by his success. "He deserved this disgrace," one senator's son whispered, too proud, too sure of himself. As chaos thickened, Chike's own memories began to betray him. He recalled Amara's silences during their engagement dinners, how her fingers always worried the edge of her napkin instead of intertwining with his. He remembered her hesitation when he announced to the press that their wedding would be the grandest of the decade. He had dismissed her unease as shyness, but now it returned to him as rebellion, quiet and deliberate. Her voice echoed in his skull, the way she once said, "I don't want my life to be a business merger." Madame Obiagu, his mother, stormed into the chaos with the authority of thunder. Her wrapper was tied like armor, her eyes two knives polished for battle. "Everybody calm down," she ordered, and the hall obeyed. She turned to Chike and gripped his shoulders with iron. "This is not how our name will be dragged in Lagos. That girl must be found. I don't care how. Even if the ground has swallowed her, you will bring her back." Her voice brooked no argument. Her empire of discipline had never known disobedience. But beneath the command of his mother's words, Chike's private fear grew claws. What if Amara had never loved him at all? What if she had only seen the mansions, the yachts, the wealth that Lagos whispered about in awe? He imagined her diary, unseen, filled with words like prison and escape. He imagined her slipping away into a bus station, free for the first time, laughing at the man who thought money could buy permanence. The thought sliced him deeper than any scandal. By evening, the media had already given the event its cruel headline, "The Wedding Without a Bride." Bloggers uploaded drone shots of the deserted wedding canopy, the roses drooping as if mourning. Hashtags trended, comedians sharpened their jokes, and across Nigeria, the name Chike Obiagu transformed from reverence to ridicule. That night, the Obiagu family gathered in the inner sitting room, curtains drawn against the city that was laughing outside. Chike sat hunched, the agbada now a burden instead of a crown. Madame Obiagu paced like a general searching for a new war to declare. Ifeoma, his younger sister, watched quietly, her eyes pools of worry. The air reeked of perfume, sweat, and unspoken shame. Then, just as the clock struck 9, the door creaked open. A figure stepped in. A woman in a flowing veil, face hidden behind an ornate white mask, body wrapped in the bridal gown that should have been Amara's. Her voice came soft, muffled, trembling with strange assurance. "I am Amara. I have returned." The room froze. Even the generator seemed to hold its breath. In the suffocating silence of that private meeting, a masked woman now stood where Amara should have been, claiming her name, her place, and her love. Gasps echoed in the candlelit dining hall as the veiled figure entered, her steps so measured, so eerily familiar, that for a heartbeat the room believed in miracles. The chandeliers above trembled with light, throwing diamonds across the polished marble floor, as if the house itself wanted to catch this apparition in brilliance. The air grew heavy, every throat thick with unsaid words. She walked in silence, her bridal gown trailing behind her like an obedient shadow, the lace whispering against the ground. The veil covered her from crown to chin, and where her face should have been, the Amara every guest remembered from magazines and tabloids, there was now only the chilling artistry of an ornate white mask, carved with delicate swirls, lips painted faintly pink. "I am Amara," the figure announced, her voice soft but strangely muffled. "I have returned." The words fell into the silence like pebbles into a deep well. They rippled outward, shaking the composure of every person present. Chike, standing rigid by the mahogany table, felt his heart convulse against his chest. He had faced oil magnates with cutthroat reputations, politicians with crooked promises, but never had his pulse betrayed him like this. The voice was similar to Amara's, yet not exact. It carried a hesitation, a hushed texture, as though spoken by someone wearing another woman's soul like borrowed fabric. "Remove that thing from your face!" Chike barked, anger sharp as glass, pointing at the mask. But the figure recoiled instantly, clutching the veil with gloved fingers as if her very life depended on it. "No!" she cried, stepping back into the shadows. "I cannot! You would not understand. There was an accident. I carry a scar that should not be seen on such a night. Please, Chike, it is me. Believe me." The room tightened with disbelief. Ifeoma, Chike's younger sister, stared wide-eyed, her sharp instincts buzzing with alarm. The resemblance in body shape, in carriage, in poise. It was uncanny. Yet the face, The one proof of truth was hidden as though she had buried it. Madame Obiagu's reaction, however, came swift and merciless. She rose to her feet, wrapper swaying, and declared, "Enough! This is Amara. Our daughter has returned to us. Do you not see her? Do you not hear her?" Her voice was iron, her tone a command disguised as faith. She strode forward, clasped the masked woman's hand, and drew her close as though shielding her from suspicion itself. "God has spared us disgrace," she said firmly. "This wedding will proceed, but at the right time. We cannot allow Lagos to dance on our shame." Family members exchanged skeptical glances, but none dared challenge her. They had lived too long under Madame Obiagu's reign of control to mistake her word for suggestion. Chike, however, stood suspended between suspicion and desperate relief. He wanted to yank the mask away, to confirm with his eyes what his ears and heart doubted. Yet, seeing the figure before him, her frame clothed in Amara's bridal elegance, her movements so familiar, it softened something within him. Could trauma explain the mask? Could fear explain her strange tone? Could love explain why she had returned at all? His confusion gnawed at him like a rat in the dark. The family huddled quickly, decisions made in urgent whispers. The public must not know. The wedding was to be quietly postponed, for health reasons. Guests would be dismissed politely, compensated lavishly if necessary. The truth, that the bride had vanished, reappeared, and now hid behind a mask, was too grotesque, too dangerous to allow out. That very night, Madame Obiagu summoned her chief of staff, pressing a thick brown envelope into his palm. "You know what to do," she said. And so bribes flew across Lagos like birds. Bloggers silenced, photographers threatened, rumors smothered before they could breathe. Still, whispers slipped through cracks. "The bride no gree show her face. Abby she don't change? Something dey off." Within the estate itself, the servants carried their own gospel in hushed tones. They whispered in the corridors while washing plates, while ironing agbadas. This Amara was not the same. She avoided mirrors, flinched when spoken to suddenly, and never once allowed herself to be seen without that mask. At night, they claimed, her door was locked from within, and her silhouette by candlelight seemed to move with the wariness of a fugitive. Chike drifted in his own torment. He replayed their courtship in his mind, the debates about books, her insistence on eating street suya despite his warnings, the way she once argued with him about sending her younger brother abroad, saying, "Love is not just generosity, Chike. It is listening." This masked figure in his house echoed Amara's laugh, but lacked its soul. He began to fear that what he loved was not standing before him, but only a reflection borrowed from memory. Yet every time he tried to corner her with questions, she answered with just enough detail to sway him. The day he had first taken her to Tarqua Bay, the ring he had given her at the exact spot where the waves broke in thunder, the moment she whispered she was afraid of the future. All the details were there, yet spoken like a script rehearsed too carefully. "Do you not see her?" Madame Obiagu would repeat whenever his doubt rose too high. "Amara has returned. God does not grant second chances twice," so he stayed silent, torn in two. The household became an uneasy theater. Meals were eaten in stiff silence, the clatter of cutlery louder than any laughter. Staff avoided lingering near her. Guests who inquired were met with vague smiles and firm refusals. At night, the masked bride moved through the corridors like a shadow queen, her veil fluttering as though even the air was not permitted to touch her face. But the house had ears, and even secrets tire of silence. One maid, young and restless, swore she heard something strange one night while returning from the kitchen with a tray of water. The masked woman's door had been slightly ajar, candlelight flickering through. The maid had paused, curiosity pinning her feet to the floor. From inside came a voice, low, hurried, speaking on the phone. But it was not Amara's voice. It carried a strange accent, Igbo twisted with another tongue, sharp consonants that did not belong to the bride Lagos knew. The maid leaned closer, heart pounding, until the words cut clear into the night. They believe me. Even he believes me. Soon, everything will be mine. The girl gasped and dropped the tray. The crash echoed down the hall like a gunshot. Inside the room, the masked woman fell silent. The maid's discovery threatened to unmask the stranger. Was this truly Amara returned, or an impostor hiding beneath borrowed lace and lies? The mansion corridors became stages of paranoia, narrow theaters of polished marble, where every footstep sounded like a rumor rehearsing its lines, and every whisper arrived with the authority of a confession. By morning, the air inside the Obiagu estate had thickened into something you could wade through, a humid stew of perfume, generator exhaust, and fear. Housekeepers drifted between suites with brooms held like rosaries, their eyes refusing to meet the gilt-framed mirrors that multiplied their anxieties into infinity. Somewhere near the staff entrance, a steward swore he had seen the chauffeur return at dawn with mud splashed up the Lexus like an indecent tattoo, and that he had heard the radio in the security lodge sputter the word Enugu before a superior snapped it off. In the laundry room, the women spoke with their backs to one another as if speech itself might be surveilled by the walls. A girl had said she saw the real Amara at Jibowu yesterday evening, head wrapped in a plain scarf, buying a night ticket to Enugu and clutching a small bag to her chest like a child. "I saw her, oh," the girl insisted, eyes shining with the thrill of proximity to chaos. "I swear on my mother's yam barn." The others shushed her, not because they doubted, but because belief had become dangerous. The masked woman moved through those same corridors like a phantom inventing gravity as she went, always hugging the brighter paths where chandeliers bullied the shadows into submission, yet avoiding the mirrors along the way with a discipline that bordered on worship. When a houseboy polished the hallway glass, she paused at a distance and turned her head, as if the spray itself might betray her. In dim corners, she shortened her breath, skirted lamps as though their pools of light were revelations she could not risk. She never removed the veil outside her room. Even the gentlest breeze that threatened to lift a corner saw her hands fly up in frantic defense, a sequence so practiced it seemed like muscle memory acquired under duress. Staff learned to look away, as people do when a wound demands privacy. But the human mind is an unfaithful servant. It recorded, compared, and judged anyway. Chike's inquiries began with the stiffness of a CEO conducting a performance review and softened, session by session, into the ache of a lover trying to recognize a familiar silhouette in a storm. He asked about their Tarkwa Bay afternoon, and she answered, "We wore white. The sea stained it gray, the way Amara once had," but her mouth paused before the precise detail of the vendor who sold them coconuts and underpriced laughter. He asked about the stray dog at his Ikoyi office that she had christened with a name too serious for a dog, and she said, "Justice," almost correctly, but after a heartbeat's hesitation that felt like a lie learning to breathe. He pressed further. The first argument they had about sending her brother abroad, the exact book she threw on the sofa when she told him, "A woman is not an annex to a man's achievements." The scent of the roadside suya she insisted on eating despite his warnings about reputation. Each time the answers arrived with accurate bones but unfamiliar flesh, as if someone had memorized the pages of their history and missed the grammar that made it beautiful. In the hours between questions, grief spread inside him like a slow dye. He remembered the rebellion in Amara's laughter, the way she laughed not to please a room, but to interrogate it. He remembered her playful sacrilege in the church pew when she leaned over and whispered that even angels must get bored of watching men pretend. He remembered her taking off her shoes at a charity event, because the hall was airless, and My Toes Need Democracy, and how the donor class pretended not to see. That woman had been a lantern, bright in ways that made him feel both found and flayed. The figure beside him now was a candle under a cup, flickering, cautious, ready to die at the first draft. Lying awake, he admitted what he would not say aloud. Beside this careful stranger, a cavern was opening in him, and no amount of money could fill it. Ifeoma watched all of it, the way only a younger sister can, marked by years of studying a brother who had taught himself to be thunder. She noticed how the masked woman counted her steps from sofa to door as if mapping exits, how her wrists bore the faint calluses of work not expected of a judge's daughter, how the cadence of her Igbo was fractionally different, delta vowels trespassing on Anambra consonants. When she tried to laugh with the stranger, the sound returned counterfeit. When she attempted intimacy, she found a careful politeness as rigid as starch. Ifeoma's skepticism sharpened into a vow. Truth, she decided, might be cramped and stifled in this house, but it had not died, only retreated, waiting for someone stubborn enough to call it back. Madame Obiagu sensed the mutiny of doubt and walled herself against it with the architecture she knew best: control. She ordered new protocols. No staff member was to address the bride directly unless spoken to. No one was to mention Enugu or buses or any city south of Asaba. Phones were to be surrendered in certain wings. All inquiries from the press would pass through her office, which had suddenly become a fortress of press releases written in antiseptic English. At family prayers, she thanked God for restoring Amara to us, with a smile that showed all her teeth. And afterward, she cornered Ifeoma in the corridor with a look that made obedience feel like oxygen. "We will not be the clowns of Lagos," she said. "Wealth is not sin. Letting the poor gossip on your name is." Reputation, in her catechism, was more sacrament than symbol. As the day wore on, she performed small, strategic kindnesses to the masked woman, hovering, defending, insisting. Each gesture, a brick in the facade she preferred to reality. Outside, the paparazzi laid siege. They camped at the gates with tripods and impatience, calling out to security men who had perfected the art of hearing without listening. Drones buzzed the hedge like curious locusts until a terse phone call from someone high. Enough made them vanish. A van from a gossip channel arrived with a presenter wearing too much foundation and a grin sharpened for scandal. When turned away, she filmed an angry monologue by the roadside, waving printed rumors like certificates of truth. "Where is the bride?" her headline screamed before the internet swallowed it whole. Small boys in school uniforms pressed their faces to the fence after class, hoping for a glimpse of a fairy tale collapsing. On Instagram, the wedding hashtag mutated into a scrapyard of jokes and conspiracies. Timelines became carnivals of schadenfreude where everyone bought a ticket. Inside, the servants learned to drop their gaze when the masked woman passed, and then learned to look again when she had gone, because something about her passage through rooms rearranged the air. Her perfume, expensive and unfamiliar, clung too long, as if compensating for a person who could not quite inhabit the spaces she moved through. Even the cook, who claimed neutrality born of stew, remarked that the bride's appetite had altered. She asked for soups with the pepper dialed low, an oddity for a woman who once boasted she could drink fire disguised as broth. "People change after trauma," Madame Obiagu snapped, overhearing, and the kitchen went quiet as a closed casket. Afternoons bled into evenings that arrived too early, like someone switching off the day without warning. The estate's generators sang their deep-throated hymns. Security radios crackled with coded sentences. Somewhere, a saxophone practiced scales that floated over the pool like a ghost trying to learn to sing. Chike stood on the balcony, shoulders squared against a city that refused to lower its gaze, and told himself that he would not be undone by a mask. Yet when he imagined pulling it away, his fingers faltered. Beneath it lay either salvation or the final proof of his foolishness, and both frightened him. He kept seeing Amara's eyes in his mind, those quicksilver windows, and every time he turned back to the figure who claimed her name, the shutters stayed drawn. When night finally conquered the estate, Ifeoma did not sleep. She had been collecting small anomalies like coins, the slight pause before the stranger said, "Good night, Mummy," the way she signed a thank you card with a rounding of the R that did not belong to Amara's hand, the half-swallowed exclamation, "Chai," with an accent tilted just a few degrees away from home. She waited until the house fell into that depthless silence that follows a day choked with pretense, then slipped on a dark wrapper and soft-soled slippers, her heartbeat a drum-practicing restraint. She counted the corridor's steps the way she had watched the masked woman do, and then she counted them backward. She had always been good with patterns, with palindromes of behavior that revealed more than words. The masked woman's door surrendered to a gentle push. To Ifeoma's surprise, the lock had not caught. Inside, the room smelt of candle wax and something powdery, an old-fashioned scent staged to suggest gentility. Moonlight drew a pale path across the rug. The gown hung on its mannequin like a witness refusing to testify. On the vanity, a row of cosmetics stood to attention, and beside them, a leather handbag lay half open, a tongue of silk scarf peeking out like a secret daring to be told. Ifeoma's hands shook, less from fear than from the dangerous clarity of a hunch confirming itself. Yet they found composure, moving with the careful disrespect of someone who believes truth outranks courtesy. She eased the bag toward her, parted the zipper as if lifting a bandage. Inside, she found a small pouch stitched with cheap gold thread, incongruous among the luxury. Her fingers opened it and discovered a passport, navy blue, its edges slightly frayed, the laminate shining faintly in the moon, like a lie polishing itself. She held her breath and flicked it open to the biographical page, ready to see Amara Nwosu stare back in official typeface, ready to scold herself for paranoia. But the name was different. The photograph showed the same cheekbones beneath a plainer headscarf, the same mouth without its painted discipline, eyes set in a face that tried to appear fearless for the camera. The letters on the page arranged themselves into a truth that emptied her lungs. Not Amara at all, but another woman entirely, a name that had never been spoken in this house. With the passport trembling in her hands, Ifeoma stood frozen in the masked woman's room, staring at a stranger's name where her brother's bride should have been. The passport quivered in Ifeoma's hands, the laminate catching a sliver of moonlight as the name stared back with insolent certainty. Adaize, a woman from a small Anambra village that had never been invited into the gleam of Banana Island. She stood in the hush of the masked woman's room, with the hum of the generator threading through her spine, each second a bead of sweat slipping between her shoulder blades, each breath a negotiation with panic. The photograph showed the same cheekbones softened by a plainer scarf, the same mouth without lipstick's courage, eyes that were alert not from privilege, but from practice. The village name beneath the seal, Neni, folded the map of Nigeria in her mind until all roads seemed to lead away from Lagos. In a house that believed money could command the weather, the single word felt like harmattan dust blown into silk. Ifeoma slipped the passport back like a thief who refuses to steal, and in that same motion made a decision. She would find the village. She would ask questions the marble floors could not answer. She would learn who this Adaize was and how her name had become a mask inside their home. Before dawn, she left. Not in the obvious way. No family driver with white gloves, no convoy to announce her importance to policemen who already knew which cars to salute, but in a simple Ankara dress and wig that sat a little too politely on her head. She told the night guard she needed fresh air and slid past the gate with the glide of a woman who'd been raised to make space move out of her way. A rideshare took her to Jibowu Park, where night buses groaned and hissed like whales, where hawkers sold gala and bottled miracles, and where prayers floated above the diesel fumes like voices tired of being ignored. She chose a bus to Awka, sat by the window, and watched Lagos fall away, its lights blinking like a stubborn lover, refusing to admit she was leaving even for a day. Morning brought the red earth of the east rising like a memory to meet her. Onitsha Bridge stretched over the river like a dare, and women bent over basins by the road shook water out of clothes that would be dry before gossip finished its walk. From Awka, she found Okada to Neni, the wind whirring at her scarf, the rider shouting stories about politicians as though history were a joke that only he remembered correctly. The village announced itself not with a signboard, but with an intimacy. Children racing barefoot, goats negotiating with drains, a church bell counting time in decades. A PHCN pole leaned with the weariness of an elder who had told the same story too often. "Welcome, Auntie," a woman selling garden eggs said, eyes scanning Ifeoma's careful wig and city shoes. "You a fine person?" "I'm looking for a days," Ifeoma replied, leaving out every surname she did not know and the one she dare not confess. The woman's eyes shifted, quick as a curtain. She pointed with a lip jutted toward a row of low houses weathered by weather and persistence. "Go front small. Ask for Mama Ijoma. She sabi everybody matter. Mama Ijoma's compound was a geometry of scarcity and order. Flowers coaxed from reluctant soil, a clothesline carrying shirts like prayers stretched out to dry, a bench polished by generations of waiting." The woman herself sat with a pestle across her knees, eyes clear, wrapper knotted in the practical way that announced she expected life to fight back. When Ifeoma asked, using a voice tuned between authority and humility, the older woman's gaze sharpened. "A days," she repeated, as if tasting a fruit to check for rot. "Fine girl." Ambition full her body like heat. She carry her mother's beauty and her father's stubbornness. God rest his soul. And we know her. The pestle tapped the mortar gently, like punctuation. She go Lagos when she be teenager. Follow one anti-way talk, say work day for housemaid. Chai, Lagos, swallow children like groundnut. As Ifeoma listened, the village collected itself to speak. A neighbor with salt in her hair, a boy whose bicycle chain chewed his trousers, a tailor whose measuring tape hung like a priest's stole. One by one they came, pulled by the magnet of a story leaving the village and threatening to return in mystery. The tale spilled in fragments, stitching itself into something like a life. Adaiz as a child carrying water from the borehole, balancing it with a ballerina's poise but a warrior's jaw. Adaiz sitting by kerosene lamp with torn magazines, tracing the shapes of women whose smiles promised passwords to better worlds. Adaiz at 14, telling anyone who would listen that poverty was a sickness she refused to catch. In their words, she was always beautiful, but the kind of beauty that understood its power and resented its limits. She watched buses to Awka with a gaze that treated distance as an insult. When the auntie from Lagos came for a funeral, wearing perfume that disrespected the village's honest smells, Adaiz volunteered herself with a speed that made elders cup their mouths. "I will work," she had said. "I will learn to iron clothes that cost more than this street. I will climb out." Her mother wept, of course, because that is the first duty of mothers at departure, and her father had already been a photograph on the wall for years, his smile stuck in better times. Lagos did what Lagos does. It taught a daisy to wake before the sun, to make beds that forgot their sleepers, to arrange cutlery like alphabets of class, to start shirts until they could stand up and salute. In the big house, someone whispered it belonged to a businessman with 2 phones and 1 conscience. She learned accents by television light and carried other people's secrets as if they were bundles of firewood. The driver called her fine gay, the madam called her girl, the madam's friends called her invisible, but she stored the city like contraband beneath her tongue. She learned that money is a sound, a door, and a key. She learned how to look expensive without spending, copied the way women lifted their chins when greeted, practiced their laughter in the mirror until it sounded less like hunger and more like arrival. And then there was the mechanic. The villagers shifted, voices lowering, as if heartbreak required a softer pitch. He was handsome in the way usefulness makes a man handsome, hands that fixed what power had forgotten to maintain, eyes that smiled faster than his mouth. He had a small workshop near Ojuelegba where engines confessed to him. Adaze loved him the way only a girl who has refused to love poverty can love, completely but with terms. She fed him dreams, oily sandwiches of one day, and and he ate and nodded and said, Amen. They planned a tiny life with a neat fence. But money is a third person in every Lagos relationship, and this one was impatient. The mechanic left one rainy week with a customer's car and a new woman whose nails never chipped. He tell him say he no fit marry hunger, the tailor murmured, shrugging. Not so. Something in Adaeze hardened then, the villager said. She began to speak of destiny in sentences that sounded like contracts. She told a friend that a poor girl's tears were invisible unless she learned to cry in a rich man's room. Ifeoma listened with a tightness in her chest that felt like shame for a world she enjoyed and others starved beside. She saw Adaeze refracted between these voices, a girl with fire in her throat, hands that learned to polish other people's silver while promising her own reflection a different future. Survival is not glamour. It is grit beneath the fingernails and desire that refuses to become disease. The more the villagers spoke, the more Ifeoma's anger loosened its blade. She felt a tenderness she did not ask for toward a woman who had clawed at the walls of her life until ego bled. A woman whose ambition had not been born in boardrooms, but in rooms where checking the price of cooking oil was a daily prayer. Yet no one could answer the new question blooming like hibiscus. How did Adaeze become Amara? Not merely in silhouette, which hunger can sculpt into anything, but in knowledge. Those small private memories she paraded before Chike, like trophies stolen in perfect darkness. Who taught her the precise footfall of their past? Who handed her a script written in love's handwriting? The villagers looked at one another and shook their heads. Some swore she had not been seen for months. Others claimed she had returned once in secret, dressed in a dress too fine for earth, eyes too sharp for a visitor. But none knew the machinery of the masquerade. As the sun lowered, painting the village in a gold that Lagos pretends to invent, Ifeoma moved toward the small kiosk to call her brother. Network was a stubborn goat. She held the phone high, then stood on a stone, as if height could persuade signal to become mercy. Cheek, she said when it finally connected, the first syllable spilling into relief. Listen to me. Her name is Adaeze, from Neni. She did not feel the hand before the phone was snatched. A figure in a cheap black mask, cloth tied behind the head, not the obscene artistry of the bridal room, lunged from the side, collided with her wrist, and the phone flew. Another hand pushed her shoulder. The ground rose too fast. People screamed, feet shuffled. The Okada rider from earlier shouted, "Wet and be this!" A second masked man reached for her bag. The world narrowed to elbows, dust, and the taste of iron as her lips split against her teeth. "Leave Am!" someone yelled. Mama Ijoma, surprisingly quick, swung her pestle like a relic recast as weapon, catching the second man on the arm. The boy with the bicycle rammed the rear wheel into the first thief's knee with a bravery that would later make his mother alternate between pride and punishment. The men stumbled, cursed in a clipped slang that did not belong to the village, and fled, one pocketing Ifeoma's phone, the other leaving behind a breath that smelled like hurried decisions. "What is this?" Ifeoma gasped, hands shaking as villagers gathered her up, dusting her as if she had fallen from a storybook instead of a curb. "Why would anyone?" "Auntie," Mama Ijoma said, eyes narrowed into knowing. "Trouble dey follow you from the kind house where you come. Be careful. Lagos Wahala get long legs." The words entered Ifeoma like cold water. Somebody had known she was here. Somebody had not wanted her call to reach Lagos. The neat fabric of her plan frayed at once. She thanked everyone with a gentleness earned by fear, slipped a small wad of naira into the boy's palm for his courage, and flagged an okada with urgency ringing in her bones. As the wind slapped her face on the ride to Awka, she pressed the corners of her mind together, trying to keep her courage from leaking out. Back to Lagos, back to the place where masks could sit at the dinner table and call themselves family. She reached the city after midnight. Lagos spread before her like a restless ocean that refuses to learn calm. The estate's gate recognized her and opened with its well-trained sigh. The security man stood straighter than usual, eyes too bright, as if awareness had been poured into him. Ifeoma climbed the stairs with steps she could not hear, heart beating the rhythm of secrets approaching their fever. She unlocked her door, ready to collapse into a bed that had never been so necessary. The room met her with a violence of absence, drawers flung open like mouths mid-scream, clothes gutted from hangers, the lamp on its side, its bulb a shattered sun on the carpet. Her diary ripped, pages like feathers after a hawk. The air smelled of perfume not her own, faint, expensive, resolute. On the pillow, laid with the ceremony of a calling card, sat a single white rose and a lace handkerchief stitched with tiny ornate swirls that matched the curves of a mask. Ifeoma stood in her ransacked bedroom, swallowing the metallic taste of dread. Somewhere in the house, the masked woman already knew she had been to Neni, and the message on the pillow promised a battle that would not be fought with truth alone. It began like a spell cast in daylight. Chike found himself softening whenever the masked woman entered, her steps measured, her voice dipped in deference, her praise arriving exactly where his pride had learned to ache. There was something disarmingly gentle about the way she carried silence. She never challenged his declarations, only polished them with compliments until they shone. Where Amara had once arched an eyebrow and interrogated his certainty, this figure nodded with tender fervor, calling him visionary in a tone that softened the iron in the word. At dinner, she would tilt her masked face slightly, as if listening hard not only to his voice but to the breath beneath it, and then say, "You are a builder, Chike." Lagos stands differently because you decided it should. The first time she said it, he felt the unfamiliar warmth of being seen without being questioned. The third time, he recognized the sweet narcotic in such seeing and still reached for it. Unlike Amara's fierce independence, her insistence on paying for her own books, her stubborn refusal to be chauffeured everywhere, her maddening habit of arguing the moral architecture of every business deal, the masked woman was a soft echo. She rose when he entered, folded her hands when he spoke, and offered gratitude for small favors like a woman raised in the church of gratitude. She remembered to ask about meetings he had already forgotten, and when he confessed irritation with a minister who delayed permits, she whispered, "You will prevail," in a cadence that made the prediction sound less like flattery and more like weather. In a life engineered to resist vulnerability, he began to enjoy how easily she fit the frame of his desire, as if someone had measured him in secret and stitched a wife from those measurements. And yet in the soft wash of that pleasure, questions swam like fish that refused to be caught. Was this the marriage he had wanted all along? A home without friction? A companion who cherished the empire because she cherished its emperor? He remembered Amara laughing in a taxi when he boasted about courting a foreign investor. "Congratulations," she had said, "on convincing another man with a yacht that the ocean belongs to you." He had loved her for it, and bristled too, because love is rude that way. Now the masked woman said, "Your brilliance frightens small minds," and he watched his ego lean forward like a plant toward sun. He did not know which version of himself he preferred, the man sharpened by argument or the man softened by worship, and the not knowing embarrassed him. They ate together in the smaller dining room to perform normalcy for the staff. Candlelight wrapped the table in ceremonial glow, caught on the porcelain of her mask so that she seemed lit from within. The generator's bass hum lent each meal the gravity of a distant storm. She never ate pepper the way Amara did. She asked the cook to go easy, apologizing as though refusing fire were a moral failure. The first night he noticed, he told himself, trauma had rearranged her taste buds. The second night, he realized he had begun to rearrange himself to make the rationalization hold. She would place a hand on his sleeve and whisper, "You are carrying so much," and he would swallow the rise of memory, the image of Amara rolling her eyes and telling him to put some of it down. Madame Obiagu pressed hard, as only a woman who had watched narratives devour reputations can press. In the blue drawing room, she laid out her plan with the crisp folds of a military bed. "Registry first," she said, quietly. "A small blessing afterward. You will announce new dates for the celebration later. Lagos will not be allowed to keep this day in its teeth forever." She spoke of money as anesthesia and of public opinion as a wound that must be cauterized fast. "People love a wedding," she added with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "But they love a baby. More, let the chronology become elastic." It was a strategy dressed as maternal concern. It was also the language Chike understood best: fix, seal, move on. Some of the family, Uncle Nemeka with his paunch and pardons, Auntie Kanayo with bracelets that negotiated while she waved, began to display the relieved hospitality that comes after a decision to believe. They called the masked woman our Amara and presented their acceptance like blankets against a drafted house. Others remained stubbornly unconvinced, Ifeoma, walking through rooms like a ghost carrying an unshared prophecy, watched the gentle performance with an ache that had learned to sit still. The memory of Neni clung to her skin. The ransacked bedroom had written its warning in the air she breathed. She kept her discovery quiet, not from cowardice, but from the instinct that truth without safety is a trap. Whenever she opened her mouth to speak to Chike, she found Madame Obiagu's gaze already on her, a pair of eyes that said, "Not here. Not yet. Not ever, if I can help it." Outside, the press refused to be pacified by envelopes. A gossip site ran a headline as brazen as a slap, "Where's the bride's face?" Another magazine, pretending tenderness, floated a theory about scarring from a private accident and emotional recovery, while a radio host gleefully suggested that the bride had been swapped in a Nollywood-level plot. Street comedians filmed skits at traffic lights, men in cheap masks stumbling into car windows, begging for fuel money for their honeymoon. And the comments section became a courtroom with no judge and too many jurors. Each time a drone dared the estate, security swatted it from the sky with new ferocity, but the buzzing did not stop. Rumor is a swarm that obeys a queen no one can locate. Chike found himself calling Obinna, oldest friend, business ally, the one man allowed to see how the empire was held together with wire as well as steel. They sat in the cigar room where deals had been toasted and dead ends burned. Smoke curled like vague counsel between them. "I feel ridiculous," Chike said, staring at the amber in his glass. "I'm angry with her for leaving me. I'm angrier with myself for needing her approval. And yet this..." He gestured toward the door, meaning the masked quiet moving through his house. She is kind in a way that does not argue with me. It is seductive. It is also terrifying, Obina supplied. A mirror that only shows you your best angle makes you stupid. He leaned back, eyes tired. You were never in love with obedience. You were in love with her refusal to be impressed. That's why you chased her in the first place. Chike closed his eyes and saw two tables, the one where Amara had dismantled his convenient ethics like faulty scaffolding, and the one where this woman laid soft praise over his shoulders like a shawl. Guilt flooded him, sour and clean. I feel like I'm betraying her, he confessed, the real her. And yet when the house is quiet and this Amara touches my hand, something in me unclenches. What do you do with that? Obina exhaled smoke as if expelling an answer he didn't want to give. You test what is in front of you. Not with nostalgia, with truth. Ask for the thing only she could know. He paused. And if the mask is a lie, tear it off. Evenings grew heavier after that. Chike watched more closely. He asked about a joke they shared with a priest at a charity gala. She got the punchline right but delivered it with the wrong priest's name. He mentioned a dent on the left rear door of his first car. She remembered the dent, but placed it on the right. He pulled out the bottle of palm wine from her father's village. She blessed it with the wrong proverb, smiling with a confidence that made the error scream. Each mistake was small enough to hide in beneficent explanations, trauma, stress, the mind's merciful edits. But together, they arranged themselves into a constellation that spelled a different name. The night it broke, rain argued with the roof, and Lagos answered in thunder. The masked woman had lit candles again, turning the dining room into a chapel where food was the sacrament and denial the hymn. She praised him for a logistics deal he had won that afternoon, her words gentle and exact, her hands folded like a student eager to be graded. He felt his gratitude rise, then caught it by the throat. What did I whisper to you the day my father died? He asked quietly. She stilled. The mask did not move, but something behind it did. You said, she began, careful, that grief is an ocean. I said, he replied, voice tightening, that grief is a thief that leaves the front door open. And you said, then let's lock the windows. He leaned across the table, the candle shaping his determination into unfamiliar angles. Take off the mask, her chair scraped. The room breathed. No, she said too fast. I told you, there is a scar, a shameful scar. Then show me your scar, he demanded, softer than anger, harder than pleading. Or show me your face. He reached, not roughly, but with the inevitability of a man who has finally chosen the pain of knowing over the anesthesia of doubt. His fingers touched the edge of the veil, tugging at lace that had pretended to be mercy. She screamed, not a dainty shriek fit for salons, but a sound pulled from a depth that did not know table manners, a feral, terrified tearing of air. Her hands shot up, slamming his wrist away with a force that shocked him. The candlestick toppled, wax skittered like frightened birds. The glass shattered into bright failure. She shoved him again, breath ragged, back hitting the wall with a thud that sent a painting crooked. "Don't touch me!" she cried, voice jagged, the vowels of another place bleeding through the mask of Amara's schooling. Her chest heaved. Her gloved fingers trembled at her cheek as though holding her face in place. Staring at the trembling figure across the ruined candlelight, Chike felt the last safe lie slide off the table. Whatever lived beneath that mask, love or deception, was not going to be revealed gently. In Enugu, where the mornings arrived like clear water and the afternoons remember the taste of coal, Amara lived inside a rented room the size of a paused breath, teaching herself how to be small enough to survive. She had chosen the room because it was nothing like Banana Island, because it did not pretend to be a palace, because its single window faced a mango tree that did not gossip. The paint peeled in polite curls, and the floor tiles were a chorus of mismatched notes. Still, when the door clicked shut behind her each night, she felt a kind of relief that expensive locks had never given. The landlady, Mama Chidi, had looked her up and down on the first day. The skirt ironed too well for this street, the posture that confessed a history with softer chairs, and asked for 6 months' rent in advance. "We know they do story here," she had said, palm out. Amara paid with the trembling decisiveness of a woman who knows her past has too many listeners. She introduced herself as Miss Ada, the name landing on her tongue like a compromise with fate, and in that room she curated a life of deliberate smallness. 2 buckets for water, a table that tilted when truth did, a mattress that exhaled tired air each time she lay down and pretended to belong. She wrote letters in the evenings after the children's chatter bled out of the compound, after the PHCN had disgraced itself and the compound generators growled to life like unrepentant dogs. In the quiet between those 2 sounds, she wrote to her younger cousin, Kosi, who still sent her voice notes crammed with the optimism of girls who believe the world is a wardrobe that will always open for them. "Dear Kosi," she would begin, and then the words would betray her, because love makes a person sentimental and fear makes her precise. She told Kosi about chalk dust that followed her home like fragile snow, about the smell of okpa at the junction in the mornings, about the boy in primary 4 who pronounced philosophy as if it owed him money. Sometimes she wrote about the way the sunrise looked over the city from the back of a keiki, the metal frame cutting the sky into hopeful squares. But there were other letters, the ones she never folded properly, the ones that fidgeted beneath her fingers like startled birds. In those she used a language she would not put in a post office. "I am safe for now. I am sorry I'm a shadow. Tell Mama I love her and that this is the only way I know to keep from drowning in silk." She piled the letters in a shoebox under the bed, next to the emergency cash and the spare SIM card, the unsent paper, a small cemetery of everything she could not say aloud. She had not vanished because of cold feet or fashionable rebellion. She had left because truth had knocked and kept knocking until the hinges shook. It had begun innocently, if there's innocence left in houses like Chike's, with the curiosity of a bride who wanted to know what her love put his name on. She had asked basic questions about contracts and compliance, the way a lawyer is trained to do, and been handed glossy reports that smelled of cologne and confidence. But behind the gloss was a hum she could not ignore. Numbers repeated when they should have varied. Subcontracts floated in a fog of shell companies with the same 3 directors wearing different names. Then came an evening of overheard sentences, a door not properly closed to a conference call where men with calm voices priced human risk as if they were discussing the best season for tomatoes. Stolen product, she learned, did not always mean thieves in the creeks. Sometimes it meant deals signed with men who carried state authority in their left hand and private greed in their right. There were references to security payments that did not end up with security, to safety reports rewritten until they behaved, to trucks with tired brakes returning to the road because delivery targets had no sympathy for mortality. She found emails with the tenderness of a lover. "Your pipeline will be safe under our vigilante watch. The boys will keep quiet. Your boys will be paid." Messages that made her stomach turn like bad oil. She Googled villages whose rivers now glistened for the wrong reasons and understood that profit had been polishing itself with the sweat of people without microphones. It would be easy, she thought, for one foolish hour, to fix it from within, to hold his hand with one hand and sign reform with the other, to wield love as a crowbar. Then she remembered the rooms where decisions were made, remembered how wealth builds walls and calls them necessary. Marriage, she knew, was not only a vow, but a binding. Assets, allies, narratives. To stand beside him at the altar was to braid her name into a story that would trample the truth if it inconvenienced a quarter's earnings. She loved him in that tender, complicated way that Tender, complicated men inspire, but she could not swear to be the first lie his future required. So she ran. Not dramatically, no cinematic sprint. She left quietly in the thin light before dawn on a day heavy with photographers, her bag packed with the simple things women take when they abandon a dream. Flat shoes, certificates, a phone without the histories, a scarf that can learn new faces. In Enugu, she purchased a pair of glasses she did not need, let her shoulders learn humility, tied her jeel like a woman who had never known headpieces engineered by stylists. She became Miss Ada at a private primary school that paid exactly what it promised and nothing more, and on the first day, when she lifted chalk to the board and wrote the parts of speech, something inside her loosened. The white of the sapal, chalk dust, the squeak of her hand learned a language that was not about procurement, but about clarity. She stood before children who stared as if she were a new sky and taught them that nouns could hold their names in any storm, that verbs must move and be honest about it. She laughed when little Chisholm insisted that footballer is the highest noun in the land, and she fought back tears when a Daobi asked, "Auntie, what is the opposite of fear?" "Courage," Miss Ada answered, hearing the lie ring in her own mouth. Courage is the opposite. Guilt stayed with her like a second skin. On Sundays, she walked past church compounds and lingered by open windows, letting the warmth of Igbo choruses wash the edges of her loneliness. She imagined her mother's face bent over a rosary in Lagos, imagined the whispers marching through the pews where judges and their wives sit and pretend humility. She pictured headlines slicing her family's pride into content and felt rage at her own moral arithmetic. Was this nobility or cowardice? Each time she asked, the question offered only another question in reply. At night she lay awake listening to the thin wall converse with the next room's radio, to the neighbor's generator cough itself into obedience, to the city hesitate and then go on, as cities do when they are too tired to notice a woman deciding who she must become. Men began to appear in the periphery the way bad omens always test their volume before the final announcement. At Ogbate Market, she recognized the same face twice in the fish row, eyes skittering away when caught. One afternoon on Okpara Avenue, a black saloon car matched her pace too precisely, then pulled ahead and waited by a pharmacy. When she turned into a bookshop that smelled deliciously of dust, the car drifted on as if it had changed its mind. At the school gate a week later, a man in a cap asked whether Miss Ada would be interested in a better-paying position with a foundation. The headmistress shooed him away with a savagery that hinted at her own story with wolves. "Coal City girls no be moo-moo," the woman hissed under her breath. Amara smiled gratefully and then fled to the staff room where she shook until the tea went cold. "I want freedom, not a golden prison," she whispered into the pillow on the worst night, when the compound went black and even the generators seemed unwilling to interfere with darkness. She cried as quietly as possible so that the woman in the next room would not hear, tasting salt and the metal aftertaste of decision. She missed the man who had held her by the shoulders after her father's funeral and said, "Grief is a thief that leaves the front door open." She missed his complicated tenderness, the way he could be careless with ethics and careful with her pain. Love is unfair. It keeps visiting even after it has been told to leave. She pressed the pillow harder and repeated her sentence as if repeating a line in court. "I want freedom, not a golden prison." The room answered with the solemn patience of walls that have seen tenants barter comfort for conscience. The school offered brief refuge. Children do not care for masked scandals. Their world is immediate and loud. But the world outside the compound was learning her new face too quickly. A neighbor mentioned that two men had asked which room the teacher lived in. A girl selling groundnuts near her street called Auntie Ada, "Good evening," with the reckless friendliness of children, and a man in a parked kek turned sharply at the name. Conspiracy moved closer, not with the theatrics of Lagos, but with the provincial efficiency of men who have been given instructions by someone who signs impressive checks. She changed her route, turned left where habit wanted right, started to wear a poorly tied scarf that fell over her face and made her look like a woman ashamed of an imaginary scar. The irony did not amuse her. That evening was ordinary in all the ways that ensure disaster feels personal. She boiled yam and salted it with the ruthless restraint of a woman paying attention to money. She graded 2 exercise books, writing small encouragements that she wished someone would write inside her chest. The rain came politely at first, then rudely, the water tattooing the zinc roof until it sounded like an argument she had lost long ago. PHCN blinked and died. She lit a candle. In that rectangle of pooled light, her life looked almost coherent. The shoebox under the bed, the bag pre-packed for flight, the passport that did not match the newspaper's name for her, the letters to Kosi that waited like obedient soldiers for a commander who would never arrive. She heard it then, the soft click at the door that was not the building shifting, the whisper of a latch moving with the delicacy of a pickpocket. Her first thought was an old Lagos thought, security. But there was no one to call who would arrive without a bill attached to their rescue, and besides, her phone had learned to live asleep to avoid conversations that might rearrange her future. The second thought was prayer, but even God expects action at the beginning. She stood, the candle drawing her shadow tall and credulous on the wall, and reached instinctively for the shoebox, for the cash, the SIM, the plan that had kept her blood from lying down. The rain leaned harder. The doorknob twitched with a courtesy that felt like mockery. She took 2 steps back, heart trying to batter its way out, and turned to snatch her bag from the chair. A hand, dry and certain, closed over her mouth from behind, another slamming her wrist to her sides with practiced efficiency, the candle flickering as if it too had been startled into fear. The mango tree outside waved helplessly. The room shrank to breath and grip and the rush of rain. In the small rented room that had promised anonymity, Amara felt the iron certainty of discovery clamp down. She'd been found. They dragged her into the back seat so fast the candle's tremble was still on the wall. A blindfold yanked over her eyes while the rain hammered the zinc roof as if it had been bribed to be noisy. The smell of wet dust and rubber choked her as the door slammed into her knees and the car lunged forward with the impatience of a getaway. Hands pinned her wrists. A voice told her to keep quiet in a tone that carried the experience of men who had made too many people keep quiet. Amara's cheek pressed against worn upholstery that smelled of old sweat and engine oil. She tasted fear and the metal hint of blood from where her teeth had cut her lip. The blindfold held the world at arm's length, turning every sound into a guess. Tires slapping puddles, a horn insulting some pedestrian, wipers beating a panicked metronome, a phone vibrating near her ear like a trapped insect. "No noise," the driver said, accent flattened by purpose. "You know fit shout past this rain." The man beside her tightened his grip and laughed softly, the way a man laughs at a private joke. She wanted to pray, and found that her throat had forgotten how to shape the first word. She forced breath into her lungs and remembered her father telling her at 15, on the day he let her stand in the courtroom gallery for the first time, that power is not a costume but a hunger, and that greed can dress like governance. "There are men," he had said, voice carrying the warning of a man who loved her more than his own certainty, who will put a ribbon on a wolf and call it civilization. She had not understood then. She understood now, blindfolded in a stranger's car, wrists aching, rain rehearsing chaos on the roof. The car's interior gathered a second conversation, the kind of whisper that believes the blind cannot hear. "She knows too much," the passenger muttered, thumbs busy on a phone, Igbo silted with another tongue. Oga say make we make sure she no go Lagos again. At all, the driver grunted, a sound of agreement and worry colliding. Now why dem say make we handle em for here, he said. No noise. No wahala. By tomorrow it go be like she travel. The words crawled under her skin like cold ants. She turned her face toward where a human face might be and begged without pride, voice cracking open like a drought-finding rain. Biko, I will go away. I will not speak. I will disappear. I just want to live. Silence replied first, followed by a sigh that twisted into irritation. Madam, the man said at last, you too dey talk. Keep your promise for your mind. The car slowed, turned, slowed again, like a predator choosing the quietest path. When they finally stopped, the rain softened as if out of respect for the new room of fear. Back in Lagos, night had dressed the Obiagu estate in luxuries that could not disguise the ways a house mourns. Chike slept badly, his body exhausting itself into uneasy truce, only to be dragged awake by the same nightmare, the corridor in his mansion stretching into a tunnel, Amara at the far end, veil torn, mouth open with a scream that made no sound, hands reaching for him as if he were both rescue and ruin. He would wake with a shudder, the sheets tangled around his legs like accusations, sweat making his skin a map of guilt. The masked woman slept soundly in the next room, at least according to the staff who learned to listen for the absence of distress, and each morning she emerged from her private chapel of mirrors with the careful radiance of someone who knew that daylight is an audience. She had grown bolder, the way a person grows when they realize their leash is made of compliments. She dressed like a queen who had inherited an apology. Jail stacked into geometry, lace that cost as much as plot of land in the city's outer ribs, bangles that announced her movement a second before she arrived. She issued commands to staff with a softness that made disobedience feel like bad manners. Please ensure the roses are refreshed by noon, she would say, and roses found themselves replaced before the hour arrived. The pepper should be mild today, she'd add, and the cook, who had once sworn he would never be micromanaged by a bride, adjusted the stew as if adjusting weather. Madame Obiagu praised her with the fluency of a woman who speaks power like a first language. See comportment, she told an aunt on the phone, voice rich with satisfaction. See respect. Not like these new girls with feminist madness, this one understands family. In the sitting room, she took the masked woman's hand and called her my daughter, with a warmth that would have looked like love to a camera. You are perfect wife material, she whispered, gaze flicking to where Ifeoma hovered, and the masked woman bowed her head in gratitude as if the sentence were a benediction. It might have been strategy. In this house, kindness was often a chess move. Ifeoma could not keep quiet any longer. The ransacked bedroom had turned her into a branch tired of bending. She found Chike in his office, staring at a map of pipelines as though it contained a verse in a scripture he had misread. I need 5 minutes, she said, closing the door before he could allow or deny. Then she told him about Neni, about Mama Ijoma's pestle, about the masked men who stole her phone, about Adazi's name inside an official book. She spoke without theatrics, each sentence a stone placed on a path toward the only truth she trusted. For an instant, she saw something fracture in his eyes, a flash of a man who recognizes the outline of his error. Then, pride and exhaustion stitched him back together. You are letting your imagination run, he said gently, the way a brother who taught himself to be bulletproof speaks when a sister's facts threaten his armor. You don't like her? Fine, but passports can be forged, names can... Faces too? She cut. In, the taste of sarcasm bitter as unripe fruit. Voices? He looked away, jaw clenching. The empire in him refused to take orders from a story that embarrassed it. Ifeoma, he said, a warning wearing the uniform of care. Do not play with fire you do not understand. She left before he could see her disappointment curdle into a promise. If truth needed a braver messenger, she would become one. In Enugu, the blindfold came off to a room that had forgotten sunlight on purpose. A single bulb threw a tired light into corners where boxes and oil-stained tools gathered like men with nothing to add. The walls were concrete, kissed by damp. A generator's cough came and went from somewhere behind, a reminder that captivity and country share certain inconveniences. They tied her to a metal chair with nylon rope that cut and then continued cutting, and she learned the dimensions of the space by the echo of her breath. Two men hovered, one young enough to call this a gig, one older with the dignified meanness of a professional. The older one took her bag, tipped it upside down with contempt for the smallness of a woman's life, and watched as a comb, a cheap phone, and a bundle of chalk-stained papers spilled onto the oily floor. He lifted the letters, read nothing aloud, and tucked them back with a gesture that was almost merciful. "You get sense pass your love," he said finally, as if awarding her a medal. "But sense no dey protect person we know too much." Amara measured their faces, searching for the seams of conscience. The younger one avoided her gaze, chewing the inside of his cheek with the nervous energy of a man new to crime's intimacy. The older one regarded her with an evaluator's calm. "Drink water," he offered, holding a bottle to her lips when the tape came off, and she drank because the body insists on living even while the mind imagines death. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a stranger inside her mouth. "To disappear you," he said, and smiled like a teacher correcting a student. "But we go wait." Oga de decide time. He moved to a corner where a plastic chair leaned against the wall and sank into it as if he had sat there in another decade. Hours became shadows, lengthening and folding into each other. She listened, because listening is a weapon in rooms where everything else has been removed. The warehouse sang its ugly music, drips gathering courage, rats auditioning, the generator's tired refrain. Beneath those sounds, the men's small talk created a map. They mentioned payment arriving from the city, argued about who should buy food, cursed a politician whose campaign posters peeled on the warehouse's outer wall. The younger one complained about his girlfriend, called her Amaka, with a challenging shame. The older one hummed an old high life tune and then made a call that was all coded kindness. "Yes, we day. A day okay. We day wait." She watched his thumb trace, lazy circles on the phone's back, wondering if a certain kind of ruthlessness needed comfort between tasks. She planned, because planning is the prayer of the endangered. The rope bites can become leverage if you give them time and movement. The chair's leg was loose, a wobble that might become an ally. The younger man's shoelace was long enough to trip him if panic learned choreography. She cataloged her body for usefulness, the way women learn to do in countries where emergency numbers are bedtime stories. When the older man stepped outside to smoke, the younger moved closer under the pretext of checking knots and whispered, without moving his lips, "If you shout, he go beat you." She nodded once. "What is your name?" She dared. He flinched as if names were contraband here. "CJ," he said, and regret lived inside the syllables. "CJ, I have a mother," she whispered, a sentence older than any country. His eyes flicked to the door. "Everybody get." He tightened the knot as if punishing himself, then walked away. In echo, the masked woman ascended the household like perfume, filling corners that were not spaces but permissions. She sat in Madame Obiagu's car when they drove to survey a plot of land for a future school that would carry the family name, asking strategic questions that suggested she had studied the family's appetites. She corrected a steward's posture with a joke that made the man laugh and then stand taller anyway. At dinner with two board members, she spoke little yet well, letting her masked face be the mystery that replaced whatever rumors could have conquered the room. "She is disciplined," Madam told the men afterward in a voice that had sold more deals than Chike knew. "We thank God." Occasionally, behind closed doors, the masked woman's confidence cracked, and she would sit very still, breathing like someone counting debts, before calling herself back to the script with a hand pressed to her chest. The press would not be soothed. A magazine splashed an artful mock-up of a faceless bride. A podcaster claimed sources at a hospital who had treated a mysterious scar and found no medical record attached. Hashtags refused to grow tired, as if the story had discovered the internet's secret taste for masks. Madam increased security at the gates, doubled the staff turnover, promised bonuses for silence. Even so, a paparazzo captured a blurry photo of the masked woman stepping into the garden at dusk, the veil gilded by light, and the image went viral with captions that teased the line between empathy and cruelty. "Queen without a face," someone wrote. "Face without a queen," another replied. The city laughed because it needed to. The house braced because it had to. Night deepened over the warehouse, raining settling into a mutter. The older man returned, stubbing a cigarette against the doorframe with the possessiveness of men who believe walls belong to them. He scrolled his phone, sighed, then dialed and stepped only half outside, enough to let the rain cool his face while the rest of him stayed with his hostage. "Madam," he said when the call connected, voice changing pitch the way servants' voices do around certain kinds of power. "We get am. She dey here. No wahala. We dey wait instruction." Amara's heart stumbled, then sprinted. "Madam." In Lagos, she knew many women who wore that title like a crown and a warning, but only one whose madam had shaped the rules of her days. He bowed his head slightly, listening, then answered, "Yes, ma." "No, nobody go no. She no go reach Lagos again, I swear." He laughed very softly, as if a joke's head had been patted. "We day your hand." The call ended, and in the dark between two lightning breaths, truth combusted inside her. The madam on the phone was not a generic honorific echoing down the alleyways of fear. It was a person. It was a house. It was blood she had not shared but had lived beside. Her stomach turned, rebellion rising in her throat, rage waking like a second heart. She swallowed it, because strategy prefers quiet. Bound to a metal chair in a leaking warehouse, Amara stared into the dark and felt the shape of betrayal sharpen. One of her captors had just reported to Madam, and the voice in his mouth sounded like Lagos, like money, like the matriarch who ran the Obiagu name as if it were law. Behind curtains heavy enough to strangle sunlight, Madame Obiagu sat in her private sitting room like a general in a velvet bunker, and the truth, the real truth, finally named her. Mastermind, architect, the woman who would rather set a fire than let her family shiver. The room was her sanctum, a navy blue cocoon layered in silk and secrecy, where portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilded frames, and a single crucifix gleamed above a credenza stacked with files. On the table lay two phones, one immaculate and public, the other a scuffed device that belonged to the country's underbelly. She held the latter now, her thumb caressing its cracked edge like a talisman. A moment ago, it had delivered the message she had built the last month to receive. She is secured. "Weedy wait instruction, madam." The voice had been respectful, but not slavish, the tone of a man who feared the consequences of disappointing her more than he feared the law. Madam closed her eyes and let the small victory cool her blood. The girl, Amara, with her lawyer's gaze and inconvenient conscience, had been a threat, a whisper, with the appetite to become a headline. Madam had smelled it first in the way Amara asked questions she had no business asking. Then, in the careful way she watched numbers as if they were alibis. She had seen that look years ago in a judge's eyes, curiosity weaponized by righteousness, and she had learned then what such eyes did to men she loved. The memory rose without permission. Younger, poorer, a baby on her hip, and another. Tugging at her wrapper, she had stood outside a courthouse while reporters angled their cameras to capture a woman entering the wrong chapter of a story. Her husband, God keep his wandering soul, had been named in a scandal engineered by men more sophisticated in sin than he was. She could still smell the sweat of the crowd, the sour whiff of pity as neighbors extended sympathy like expired bread. The bank took their house, friends took their distance, Lagos took their laughter and turned it into lesson. She had learned 2 sentences that year and carved them into the wall of her mind. Scandal is the only god the city truly worships, and a poor widow is a lesson, a rich widow is a legend. She had vowed that no one would ever again write her family's name in the city's mouth with anything but gold. So when she discovered Amara's plan, by accident at first, because accidents are the angels of survival, it was a Tuesday, the kind that believed itself harmless. She had entered the study to retrieve a scarf and found Amara's laptop open, cursor blinking beside a draft email addressed to a regulator whose name tasted like trouble. Attached were files Amara had quietly gathered, sanitized reports cursorily rewritten, payments to entities with 3 directors and 1 face, a chain of meaningless companies that meant everything. There was also a letter, half-typed and shaking from its own courage. Dear Sir, I am compelled by conscience to share these findings. Compelled by conscience. Madam had laughed without amusement, a sound like a knife skittering on glass. She closed the laptop gently, because gentleness could be a weapon too, and made her calls. Auntie Philomena, she had said to a woman whose Rolodex of girls was a map of hunger. I need a certain kind of girl, educable, beautiful, hungry the right way. The pause on the line was professional, not surprised. Ego cost, madam, Philomena replied. Madam's smile scissored her face into new angles. Everything worth doing costs. The girl arrived like a whisper. A daisy from Nenny, with a walk that apologized for taking up air and eyes that refused to apologize for wanting more. Not long ago she had ironed other people's shirts for a living. Now she sat very straight in Madame's second sitting room, while a tray of drinks sweated on the table between them. You are beautiful, Madame said, appraising, voice kind enough to be remembered and cold enough to be obeyed. And you are ambitious. Good. Listen to me carefully. She spoke of transformation, as if it were an altar call, of masks as if they were crowns. She painted poverty as a disease with a cure and offered Adais a prescription written in crisp notes and newer names. You will learn a woman, Madame said softly. Her gestures, her habits, her memories. Memories? Adais asked, the word catching like a burr. Madame waved a delicate hand. People are predictable, she said. They photograph themselves for you. They film their special days. They record their laughs and give you the key for free. She had already arranged the curriculum, a private room in the guest wing where Adais would study the bride the way a medical student studies anatomy, an iPad with videos of Amara speaking at charity events, laughing at dinners, hugging her mother under a jacaranda tree, voice notes stolen from a trust-too-easily maid who had been paid to export WhatsApp chats, a diary page photographed by a different servant on a night conscience slept. It will be work, Madame warned. It will be obedience. She did not describe the compensation with numbers. She used images instead. A flat in Lekki, shares that grow while you sleep, a salon of your own if you insist on small dreams. Like any good strategist, she also whispered fear. If you fail me, hunger will be gentler than what I am. Adais learned quickly the way desperation becomes intelligence when given a syllabus. She mimicked Amara's tilt of the head, measured her steps from sofa to door, practiced the lawyerly way she set her jaw before a debate. She repeated phrases, grief is a thief, until they fit in her mouth without friction. She learned to pronounce names with the precision of someone who understood that syllables can be passwords. On the night before the wedding, while the city rehearsed joy, Madame showed her the mask, white, ornate, lips blushing with ridiculous modesty. A scar, Madame explained, An accident. It will buy us time, and time will buy us everything. Adaz touched the mask and felt it vibrate with the future. The choreography after that had been delicate, but not complicated. The real bride's suspicions had to be contained, not crudely crushed, so that no corpse, literal or figurative, could be dragged into a courtroom. Threats arrived first, in anonymous letters meant to unsettle. Surveillance followed, the routes Amara took for her dawn runs, the cafe where she bought her guava smoothie, the patterns of her phone calls when questions woke her at midnight. Then a door left unlocked, an absence arranged in a different city, a cord tightened in the dark. The less Madame knew about the warehouse, the better a witness she could be if the worst story chose her. She had whispered only one instruction to the men who worked on the side of law where sunlight is unwelcome. No Lagos police, no mistakes, no body. They had nodded, grateful for clarity. Now, in the present's expensive quiet, Adaz sat opposite her, draped in a gilet that reaching for the ceiling, the mask resting on the table between them like a surrendered face. She looked smaller without it, a girl who had learned womanhood as a performance rather than a possession. Guilt had been chewing at her. Madame had seen it in the way her hands now occasionally trembled when sipping tea, in the way her Igbo lost its city polish when stress found it after midnight. Still, the girl had prospered under tutelage. Servants obeyed her. Chike's eyes softened when she praised him. The city's appetite was learning to swallow a bride with no face and still feel full. "Who am I?" Adaz asked suddenly, voice pitched low, as if afraid the walls would call her by her first name. "If I live behind a mask." The question hung in the air like incense that burns too long. Tears trembled but refused to fall, pride negotiating with regret in the tight theater of her features. "If I remove this thing," she whispered, touching the mask's smooth forehead with tenderness, "what remains? A girl from Nenny pretending to breathe another woman's past? Will this house feed me when the masquerade ends?" Madame's expression shifted through a repertoire of emotions she allowed herself to perform. Surprise, concern, a gentle version of exasperation. Beneath them, the engine of her will purred, efficient, merciless. She leaned forward, hands clasped as if in prayer. "My dear," she said, each syllable polished, "people live behind masks every day. They call some of them titles, some they call marriage, some they call modesty or humility. What is a mask? It is a tool. Do you see me?" She gestured at her own wrapper, the diamonds in her ear that caught even reluctant light. "Do you think this is who I am? I'm a widow who was laughed out of a bank hall. I am a mother who sold her jewelry to pay school fees and smiled like it was philanthropy. I learned to hold my shame the way other women hold handbags. Now, I hold power. The world forgives everything if you offer it success." She softened then, because persuasion is a choreography, not a blunt instrument. "You are not a thief, Adaz. You are an actress in a role that benefits everyone who obeys the script. You will have what you have never had: security, respect, a name that opens doors before you knock. And when the time is right, when the city is tired of this story and ready for the next, the mask will become a relic. You will be our daughter still. We will give you a new story. With or without this family, you will never return to scarcity. Sacrifice is necessary for power. This is not wickedness, it is weather." Adaz stared at her, torn between the gratitude of a rescued life and the horror of its ransom. "You promised wealth," she said, and a bitter smile cracked her poise. "But I did not know the interest rate." She rose abruptly, paced to the window, and stared at the garden where lilies pretended innocence. "Sometimes I hear her in my head," she confessed, her laughter, the way she said certain words like they belonged to her alone. In front of him, I can repeat them. Alone, I cannot own them. I dream I am drowning in other people's reflections. Madame allowed a beat of silence, then stood and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, the tenderness calculated but not wholly. Counterfeit. You will adjust. Conscience is a skirt, it can be hemmed. I promise you a days. When you learn to carry this house, it will carry you. That was when the corridor outside inhaled. If Aoma had been there for 10 minutes, a shadow stitched into the drapes just beyond the ajar door, her heart beating instructions into her throat. She had borrowed a steward's old android, wiped its memory with trembling fingers, and pressed record before slipping from her room. Every step to this point had been a negotiation with fear. She had found the angle between the cabinet with its porcelain lions and the potted plant that had long ago given up on growth, where she could see the curve of Madame's cheek and the white shimmer of the mask on the table. She had heard everything. The middle-of-the-night voice memo waiting in the phone's belly now held her mother's confession, the recruitment, the training, the reason a girl was missing in Enugu and a stranger wore lace in Lagos. She meant to leave as silently as she had arrived, but Lagos and fate and electricity seldom collaborate when women require precision. The generator hiccuped then, a bass cough that made the chandelier blink. For a heartbeat, the room went dark, and in that heartbeat the borrowed phone in Ifeoma's hand lit itself like a traitor, screen bright with a notification she had forgotten to kill. A rectangle of blue bled across the carpet. In the room, Madame's eyes flicked towards the door with a predator's efficiency. Adazi's head snapped around, the mask forgotten in her hand. "Who is there?" Madame asked, not loudly, but with a lilt that turned the question into a command. Ifeoma tried to swallow her breathing, but lungs are not trained for such obedience. She stepped back, heel brushing the baseboard, a rasp that announced her position. The door swung wider with a flick of Madame's wrist. 2 security men materialized from air that had apparently been waiting for them. One reached for the corridor light. It came on with a lazy apology. Ifeoma froze, the phone glowing in her palm like a confession that had learned to become object. Madame saw her daughter. For an instant, pain moved across her face, lightning brief, genuine. Then the matriarch returned, shoulders squaring into armor. "Ifeoma," she said evenly, gaze dropping to the phone, traveling back to her daughter's eyes. "Bring that here." With the recording of a confession burning in her hand and security closing in, Ifeoma stood caught between blood and truth, face to face with a mother who had just admitted to arranging a disappearing act and who would not let her leave the room alive with that proof. The door clicked with an elegance that mocked her, and Ifeoma realized her own mother had locked her in the private wing, the quietest prison money could design, where the air smelled of orchids and betrayal. The corridor lights hummed with the steady confidence of a place that never knew blackout, and the camera in the corner blinked its red dot like an unhelpful heartbeat. She pressed her forehead to the paneled wood and listened to the retreating footsteps she had once run toward as a child. Madame Obiagu did not even raise her voice as she gave orders, preferring the calm that made obedience feel like common sense. "No one in, no one out," her mother said from the other side, to a guard whose shoes squeaked with newness. "My daughter is overwrought." The word brushed past Ifeoma's cheek like an insult disguised as concern. She tried the handle twice more, then slid down to the floor, back against the door, palms over eyes that had not asked to witness their family's conversion of love into leverage. She cried, not prettily, not like the women on the films who dab with lace. She cried from the place inside where loyalty goes to live and sometimes to die, the tears a salt ledger of all the times she had defended this house because the roof had always known her by name. Hours arranged themselves into a cruel procession. Midday became afternoon without consultation. The AC sighed its manicured weather. The rug beneath her felt too soft to deserve her grief. She tried the windows that overlooked the inner garden. Reinforced glass offered a crystal-clear view of lilies, feigning innocence. Her phone was gone. Their last act before locking her in had been to take the old android she had used to record the confession then return it with the memory card missing and a look that said, "We are doing this for your own good." She inspected the wing with a strategist's fury. A sitting room too immaculate for comfort, 2 bedrooms she didn't need, a bathroom whose marble would remember nothing. There was a landline on the console, but the dial tone sang only to internal numbers, controlled by the same hand that had turned a mother into a wardress. The first knock arrived like contraband. A small, urgent sound at the service door, 2 taps, a pause, then 1. Ifeoma wiped her face with the back of her hand and opened to a sliver. Adaz stood there without the mask, veil draped loosely like an afterthought, a tray balanced with the tenderness of a confession, Yoloff without pepper, a bottle of water sweating its own anxiety, and a napkin folded as if presentation could soften the situation. Her uncovered face was a shock, not because of scars, but because of their absence. Without the porcelain theater, she appeared younger and more mortal, a woman whose beauty had learned resilience in cheap mirrors. "I told them you needed food," she whispered. I said a locked sister is still a sister." "Am I your sister?" Ifeoma asked, the question gentler than it meant to be. She opened the door wider. Adai slipped in and set the tray down, hands trembling in a way that announced courage rather than cowardice. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the captive and the counterfeit, both temporarily unmasked by proximity. "I envy her," Adai said at last, the words leaving her as if they had been trapped behind her teeth for days. "I envied Amara the way you envy a woman you will never meet on equal ground, her schooling, her ease, her right to be complicated. I never wished her dead." She swallowed. "Madam never said—" The sentence broke its own neck. "I didn't know where they took her." "I'm not a monster." She rubbed her wrist as if memory had handcuffed her. "I wanted a door out of a life that kept shrinking." Ifeoma felt a reluctant tenderness move through her like a cautious animal. "And instead, you walked into a mansion that shrinks everyone," she said, "including me." She poured water, the glug-glug between them a brief truce. "Listen to me, Adais. I heard everything. My mother recruited you. She groomed you. She called men in Enugu. I think Amara is alive. I think she is scared. If you know anything, if you have heard a name, a place, a code, say it." Her voice caught on the last word. Begging had never been her dialect. Adais shook her head, slow and honest. Only that Madame said, "Handle it outside Lagos, no noise." And a phone she calls the brown line. She keeps it in the blue room credenza under the rosary case. She looked up, shame and hunger wrestling in her eyes. "I did not plan to be this person. When I put on the mask, I told myself it was for a month, that after the scandal passed, the mask would come off and the story would soften, but the story grew teeth." She raised her hands, helpless. "Who am I if I live behind a mask?" "Someone who can choose to remove it," Ifeoma replied, not softly. "Help me open this door." She nodded toward the lock. "Help me break the story's teeth." A rustle in the hallway startled them both. Adaz gathered the tray, composure snapping back on like a taut head wrap. "They monitor this wing," she said quickly. "I'll come at night." "Keep courage, as if it were food." She slipped out as quietly as she had arrived. The door fell into place. The lock clicked again, polite and final. Downstairs, the house insisted on normal. But normal had a wobble. Chike began to hear his life creak, the sound a structure makes when a hidden beam goes wrong. He found himself in conversations with the masked bride that tugged at loose threads until entire sentences unraveled. "Do you remember the priest who teased us at the charity gala?" he asked one afternoon, trying to sound casual as surveillance. "The one who said your Igbo is too Lagos?" She laughed through the mask, a pretty sound that had been trained to fit. "Father Augustine," she said. It had been Father Benedict. "And what did I buy you the first time I sneaked you to the market?" he pressed. "The straw hat," she said, too proud. It had been a ridiculous mechanical pencil sharpener, shaped like a shoe that she'd mocked and then kept. He tried the secret phrase, the one that lived between them like a key under a mat. "Grief is a thief that leaves the front door open," he said, not blinking. She froze, the stillness growing limbs. "Then we closed the door again." "No," he said softly, the word a verdict. "Then let's lock the windows." Her head tilted, the silk of her veil whispering a nervous comment to her cheek. The failure did not howl, it sizzled, a quiet sound that burned more. Doubt became a climate more than a thought. At night, he lay in a room that smelled of lavender and lies, cataloging the mistakes, the pepper she could not tolerate, the proverb she misquoted with gusto, the memory misfiled like a forged receipt. He went looking for comfort in work and found new fires there. An online magazine published leaks, screenshots of anonymized memos, redacted but legible enough to make imagination do the rest. The headline married gossip to gravity. Bride runs, sources, claim Obiagu empire, built on ghost security and friendly regulators. The story braided the personal with the corporate until readers could not decide which scandal tasted better. Commentators on radio shows wore expert voices and suggested that a woman's conscience had turned in the night and fled what it couldn't launder. The hashtag number sign, the wedding without a bride, repopulated like weeds, shooting up new variants. Number sign golden prison, number sign masked marriage, number sign who is Amara. Banks called with their polite alarms, using words like exposure and review. A foreign investor postponed a tranche that had been promised with a handshake in a Geneva lobby. Vessels waiting to dock found themselves delayed by a routine audit that felt like a message. His CFO, a man who ate anxiety like beans and wore it well, came to the office with a spreadsheet that looked like a weather report. Storms, all of them. "If we don't settle the narrative," the man murmured, "we will settle for less capital." Chike nodded, felt rage and shame take turns kicking his ribs from the inside, dismissed the CFO, and stared at a photo on his desk of himself and Amara at Tarkwa Bay. She barefoot in the sand, him attempting to look casual in clothes that didn't know how. The absence in the frame gaped. He went home earlier than the house had learned to expect, his driver learning to read a new silence in his boss. The estate gates opened with reflexive respect. Inside, staff smoothed their faces to neutrality. He moved with speed that made security radios flicker. On the landing, he met his mother, her wrapper a battle flag, her eyes a no-go area. "There are processes," she began, as if she could stem a flood with diction. "We will." He stepped around her gently, the gentleness of a man refusing to argue with a storm. "Not now." He found the masked woman in the smaller drawing room, a space designed for intimacy that today staged interrogation. Dusk had smeared gold against the windows, the room's lamps tried to copy it and failed. She sat with her back straight and her gloves flawless, the mask angled to catch the light and return it as poise. When she saw him, she smiled with practiced relief. "Chike," she breathed, "I was about to—" "What did you tell Ifeoma when you first met my grandmother's portrait?" he interrupted, stepping close enough to smell the perfume that had begun to define uncertainty for him. She blinked. Her eyes are kind." "She said they could forgive," he replied, "but only after they have judged." He took another step until he could see the seam where silk met skin. "Who taught you my secrets?" His voice was low. The room leaned to listen, her breath stuttered, the veil quivered. Behind the mask he felt a calculation sprinting and tripping. "I am your Amara," she said, a claim that suddenly sounded as fragile as the porcelain it hid behind. Outside, a bird took off from the jacaranda with an indignant cry, and the sound seemed to tip something inside him. The nightmare that had been visiting him, The silent scream down a corridor flared behind his eyes. Something in him snapped its leash. In one movement, trained less by resolve than by the exhaustion of ambiguity, he reached for the mask. She flinched, but his fingers were already at the ribbon, tugging like a man untying a truth. "No!" she shrieked, springing up, hands flying to defend the border of her borrowed face. He caught her wrists mid-air with a strength he had not admired in himself before, and pulled, silk giving way with a noise too delicate for the brutality of the act. The mask slipped, clattered to the floor, rolled to a stop under a console table as if it had somewhere better to be. Chike stood panting in the half-light, the ripped ribbon coiled in his fist, staring at the face finally laid bare before him. Whatever it revealed next would either save him or finish the ruin that had already begun. The mask hit the marble with a brittle clatter that seemed to echo beyond the room, rolling across the silence like a scandal learning to walk. Gasps broke the air, gasps from servants peeking through doorways, from cousins pretending to stroll by, from Chike himself as the face beneath the porcelain was finally revealed. A daisy's true face stood naked before them, smooth skin glistening with sweat, wide eyes trembling with a guilt that had been waiting for a witness, lips quivering with words that had long rehearsed their alibis. She was beautiful, yes, but not Amara. Not the woman whose laughter had once bent Chike's pride into humility. Not the woman whose eyes contained both rebellion and tenderness. This was a stranger with borrowed gestures, a counterfeit carved by hunger and desperation, now exposed under the unforgiving light of a family's empire. Chike staggered back as if her face had struck him harder than any fist could. His breath came shallow, each inhale cutting his throat like glass. Betrayal, sharp and hot, filled his chest, until even the gold-threaded agbada he wore seemed to smolder against his skin. "Who are you?" he rasped, though the answer lay in the evidence of her trembling. "What have you done with my fiancé?" Madame Obiagu appeared instantly, her wrapper swishing like a general arriving to smother mutiny. She moved between them with arms that looked like protection but felt like a blockade. "Enough," she barked. "This is still our home, our name, our dignity. Control yourselves." She reached for a scarf on the table and tried to cover Adezi's face again, pulling the fabric up as if shame could be refashioned into concealment. But Chike snatched it from her hands, eyes blazing. "No more hiding," he thundered. "Not in this house. Not in my name." His voice carried through the halls, each word a stone hurled at the empire he had built. Adaz broke then. Her knees gave way, folding her to the polished floor where the mask still lay like a taunt. Tears surged down her cheeks in sudden, violent confession. "I never meant harm," she cried, voice cracked open by desperation. "I only wanted a chance, a life beyond dust and debt. I was a maid in Lagos. I was invisible. Men called me girl. Women called me help. I wanted more." Her shoulders shook as sobs tore through her. "They told me I could be her. They said it was temporary, that she had run away. I thought if I wore her dress, her smile, I could finally be seen." Her words flooded the room, every syllable dragging behind it the weight of a childhood she had never confessed. She spoke of Neni village, where her mother sold plantain by the roadside, hands cracked by firewood, of the father buried too young, leaving debts that ate their evenings, of the boy she had loved once, a mechanic who fixed engines but not promises, how he left with another woman because she had nothing but a heart to give. "Since then, I swore I would never be poor again," she whispered, her palms spread open in supplication. "I thought I was stepping into wealth. I did not know I was stepping into fire." For a long moment, silence reigned, silence so thick it choked. Chike, trembling, felt his pride break into shards at his feet. The empire he had crafted with sweat and audacity was mocked not only by investors and headlines, but now by this revelation. The bride at his side had been a masquerade, the laughter in his halls an impersonation. He thought of the tabloids outside, the paparazzi drones that never slept, the bloggers who thrived on humiliation. His legacy was being rewritten not by competitors or rivals, but by the hunger of a girl his mother had unleashed into his bed. And yet, somewhere between the smoke of his fury, pity flickered. He saw not only the fraud, but the hunger that had carved Adai's into counterfeit. He saw the girl kneeling on his floor with mascara rivers on her cheeks, confessing the sins of poverty and ambition. He saw her as a mirror, distorted, yes, but still a reflection of his own ruthless climb from nothing, except his path had been lined with luck, his battles sanctioned by contracts instead of masks. The pity lasted the length of a breath. Then rage returned, hotter now that it had cooled briefly. His gaze shifted from Adazi's bowed head to the diamond-studded figure of his mother. The realization landed with the weight of a gavel. This had been no accident, no misstep of fate. This had been orchestrated. Madame Obiagu, matriarch and protector, had not shielded him, but shackled him to a deception that now threatened to burn everything he had built. "You," he hissed, turning on her, his finger trembling as it pointed. "You did this." The words were both accusation and sentence. For the first time in years, he saw his mother not as iron shield, but as conspirator, a woman whose obsession with reputation had traded truth for theater. The revelation scorched him. His empire had not been wounded by enemies. It had been sabotaged by blood. Madame Obiagu held his gaze with the calm of a woman who had lived too long with fire to fear burns. "I did what had to be done," she said evenly. "I will always do what has to be done. Wealth must be protected. Name must be preserved. You will thank me when this storm passes. Thank you." His laugh was bitter, broken. "For making me a fool in front of the world. For replacing my bride with a mask. For turning my life into a market square joke." His voice cracked, a crack that echoed the crumbling foundation of everything he had thought unshakable. Adaz sobbed harder, rocking slightly on her knees, repeating, "I didn't know. I didn't know," as though the phrase could stitch her into innocence. The servants had stopped pretending to work. They lingered at the corners, their eyes wide, their loyalty now an unstable currency. The scandal was no longer contained. It lived in their memories, ready to migrate into whispers that would feed Lagos by morning. Chike pressed his palms against his temples, as if trying to keep his mind from splitting. His empire trembled not from hostile takeovers or oil shortages, but from the collapse of family. He had been a man of iron certainty. Now he was a man staring at his own mother as if she were stranger, at the woman kneeling before him as if she were both victim and traitor, at the ghosts of Amara's laughter ringing in the spaces they had stolen. And somewhere, in Enugu, far from the marble and chandeliers, chains scraped against concrete. Amara, wrists raw from rope, had worked for hours, inching the loose chair leg against the knot until the fibers finally sighed and snapped. Her hands bled, but she did not stop. She listened for the older guards' snores, the younger ones' distracted humming. When the moment arrived, when the warehouse door rattled with wind instead of footsteps, she ran. Barefoot, breath tearing her lungs. She sprinted into the night, the red earth of Enugu clinging to her feet, the rain a curtain she welcomed. Her heart beat not with fear, but with return. At the very moment Adazi's mask lay broken in Lagos and Chike's world fractured into betrayal, the real Amara slipped into the night from her captors, running, bleeding, determined, her return to Lagos already in motion. She did not knock. She burst through the great doors with dust on her skin, rain in her hair, and defiance blazing out of her eyes like headlights on Third Mainland at midnight, startling the chandeliers into an offended shimmer as Amara Nwosu stormed into the Obiagu mansion and refused to be a rumor any longer. The hall inhaled, as if sharing a single set of lungs. Staff froze mid-task, trays tilting, whispers dying on tongues. Cousins who had become spectators found their feet rooted to marble. The roses, still unnecessarily abundant, seemed to lean toward her as if scent could apologize for silence. She was bruised along one cheekbone, wrists swollen with rope's memory, the hem of her skirt dark with Enugu mud clinging like testimony. The generator droned its bass, the air condition sighed its denial, but a new weather took the room, the charged stillness that follows a lightning strike when everyone waits to learn what the fire will demand. At the far end of the room stood the other woman, veil discarded, mask exiled to some sulking corner. Her beauty a softer thing without porcelain, her hands twisting a handkerchief into confession. For one suspended heartbeat, the city's favorite spectacle assembled itself, the two brides face to face. Adazi's eyes widened with something like relief and dread braided together. Amara's gaze, steady and surgical, cut through the distance as if distance were a lie. Chike was between them and not between them, caught in the geometry of his own unmaking, one hand braced on the edge of a table, knuckles white, the other half raised in a gesture he did not complete. Madame Obiagu stepped forward with the reflex of a matriarch trained to choreograph reality. "Security," she began, voice primed for command. "Tell them to stand down," Amara said, and the strength of her voice startled even herself. It filled the room without shouting, a bell that refused to crack. She took 3 steps further, leaving red earth prints on the marble like a map back to truth. "If anyone touches me, the whole of Lagos will hear what I have to say from a press conference on your front lawn." She flicked a gaze to the nearest camera tucked near a column, the house's blinking red eye, and smiled without mirth. Or perhaps it is already listening. Silence answered, because silence had been too well fed in this house. Amara turned to Chike first, because even now, honesty preferred to move through love before entering war. "You wanted to know why I left," she said, and he lifted his head as if the words had tipped it. "I left because I opened your files and found shadows with bank accounts. I left because I heard men on your calls price the safety of villages like tomatoes, because friendly regulators is what you call men who can be paid to misplace a conscience. I left because emails do not weep, Chike, but dead rivers do. I left because your trucks carried tired brakes and no one stopped them because money had somewhere to be." Her voice wavered once, found its footing on fury. "And when I prepared to speak, your mother decided to make me disappear." All eyes pivoted to Madame. For the first time, the certainty that lived in her spine faltered. A tremor moved beneath her wrapper, tiny but treacherous. "These are lies," she declared, but her words lacked a little iron. "This girl," she gestured at Amara as if the distance could shrink the truth. "This girl ran and now returns with rehearsed drama." "I did run," Amara conceded, and the honesty landed with the thud of a stone on water. "I ran from becoming your alibi, from drowning in silk and calling it love. I ran to save my soul, and you sent men after me. In Enugu, a warehouse with a single bulb and 2 hands that belonged to the country's underside. A man who called you madam on the phone and promised, she no go reach Lagos again." She raised her raw wrists, turning them to the light, the marks a language the room could finally read. "Do you want us to call him back so you can recognize his gratitude in your ear?" A daze made a sound then, a small wounded thing. She took 2 steps toward Amara and dropped to her knees, the force of it sending a shiver through the polished floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered, head bowed, palms open like a beggar in church. "I wore your life. I did not know they would try to bury you to make room for me. I thought, God punish my foolishness, I thought you had left of your own accord. Madame said, she said it was for the family. Tears slid down her cheeks, unadorned by mascara, the salt of a girl who had learned to hate her reflection. I am not your enemy. Hunger is. Pleased, I will testify. I will say what I know. Chike swayed. He had faced shipyard strikes and dockside sabotage with a jaw that refused to unclench. Now his jaw trembled. He looked at his mother, at the woman whose shoulders had carried him through storms, and found on her face the ruins of a religion, reputation. Mama, he said, the word ancient in his mouth, a boy and a man sharing a single syllable. Did you? The question trailed off, as questions do when they have already found their answers and are only begging for ceremony. It was Ifeoma who moved the moment forward, no longer locked in the wing, because doors cannot hold daughters forever. She appeared at the threshold with a steadiness earned in corridors where truth eavesdrops. In her hand, a phone, hers again, or a replacement, glowed quietly. You don't have to answer, Mother, she said, stepping into the circle and facing the woman who had taught her strength as if it were a family recipe. You already did. She lifted the device. Your confession lives here. Recruitment, the training, the mask is a clock. Handle it outside Lagos. And the brown phone in the blue room. She turned to the credenza, opened the rosary case, reached beneath the velvet, pulled out the scuffed handset like a rabbit wrenched from a magician's hat. The room gasped as one. Evidence. Madame Obiagu's composure cracked. It did not shatter theatrically. No wails, no collapsing, but a slow fissure traced itself across the glass of her certainty. Her eyes filled, not with a coward's tears, but with a mother's, and that made it worse. I did not intend harm, she said, voice suddenly old. I swear to God who will judge me. I intended to protect you. She faced Chike fully now, her body remembering the days she had stood between her children and the world, with nothing to offer but her own chest. I have watched scandal eat better families than ours. I have watched hunger invent morality for people who cannot afford it. I thought, if I could buy time, if I could replace a bride with discretion, if I could bury a mistake under lace, we would survive. I lost everything once, my son. I ate shame for breakfast for a year. I decided never again. Never. The last word was not a vow. It was a wound. Chike's face went through storms, lightning of anger, thunder of confusion, then the quiet that follows damage when a man inventories what might be saved. He turned from her to Amara, and the ache in his eyes begged for a universe with fewer knives. Did I do these things, he asked, the strangest question he had ever asked in a house that carried his name. Did my company... He could not finish. He was a boy, asking if the monster under the bed is real, knowing he built the bed with his own hands. Amara did not gloat. Truth does not need victory laps. You knew enough not to ask more, she replied, and it was not cruelty. It was the one mercy she could afford. You benefit from not knowing. You let men translate the ugliness into quarterly growth. I wanted you to stop. I asked. You smiled and told me we would tighten controls and clean up optics. So I left, before your home turned me into something I would not recognize in a mirror. He looked like a man learning to breathe without bones. I am sorry, he said to her, and the sentence found both of them unprepared. It was not enough, but it was the first honest currency he had offered in weeks. He turned to his mother again. And you, he said, not with heat now, but with exhaustion, you call it protection. It is control dressed as love. A muscle fluttered in his cheek. You taught me to do anything for this family. You never taught me what it costs the world when we succeed. The house listened, and even the marble seemed to nod. Yes, at last. Adais crawled on her knees closer to Amara, head still bowed. Let me make it right, she whispered. Tell me where to go, who to talk to. I will sign. I will undo this as far as it can be undone. Her hands shook. I will admit my part. Just, please, do not let them kill me with silence. It was not only apology, it was the simple animal desire to keep breath. Amara lowered, not to embrace. Some distances refused to be closed in a day, but to meet her at a height where dignity can see itself. "Stand up," she said quietly. "We will both speak. Not as rivals, as witnesses. We will go to the people who are tired of being laughed out of rooms." She rose, turned to Chike and Ifeoma. "I brought copies," she added, voice steady now, the lawyer sharpening her edges. "Not just of your mother's admission. Of the memos, the shell companies, the safety reports that were turned to fiction. If not the police, then the regulators. If not them, then journalists who still remember what truth is for." She swallowed. "I will no longer be a woman who whispers into a diary." Somewhere beyond the gate, Lagos cleared its throat. The first siren wailed from a distance, then multiplied, the sound threading through jacaranda and hedge, up the driveway where security guards stiffened and turned their faces toward consequence. The cousins scattered from the hall's edges like pigeons accused of loitering. Staff looked at one another with the particular helplessness of people about to watch history wash through their place of employment. Madam closed her eyes and let 2 tears escape. Nothing theatrical, just water acknowledging gravity. Chike's hands dropped to his sides. He did not reach for anyone. He did not run. The sirens grew louder, became a swarm of blue and red washing over the white fence. Tires crunched the gravel with official entitlement. Radios crackled. A voice at the intercom announced visitors in a tone that tried and failed to be bored. "Police!" In the distance, a second set of sirens rode in a different key, press vans tasting blood. Ifeoma moved to the window and stared at the approaching lights, then back at the small assembly that had just rewritten itself. She glanced at the brown phone on the console, at the files in Amara's bag, at her mother's face. "They're here," she said, and the words did not ask, only recorded. Amara reached for the bag on her shoulder, the leather scuffed by flight, and placed it on the table as if laying an offering before an altar. Flash drives, printed emails, a diary page copied, receipts that had learned to speak. She stood straight. Her bruises did not shrink her. "Let them in," she told the nearest guard, who had wandered into the doorway looking for permission. "We will answer questions." She glanced at Chike, still torn, still trying to locate the edge of the cliff and the beginning of the bridge, and held his gaze without flinching. "All of us." Outside, doors slammed. Boots met stone. A bell chimed twice, too polite for the urgency it announced. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot of stew pretended to continue its simmer because food does not know when a house is on trial. The roses, stubborn, kept smelling expensive. As the police crossed the threshold and the mansion braced for impact, a single question crackled in the charged air. Whose wrists would feel the first cold bite of handcuffs? The matriarch who engineered the mask, the heir whose empire fed on shadows, or the imposter who had turned her hunger into a borrowed face? The raid did not enter politely. It thundered through the gates with blue lights painting the jacaranda in frantic strokes, boots pounding marble like war drums, and for the first time in years the Obiagu mansion, fortress of wealth and intimidation, felt the cold hand of law. The foyer filled with uniforms, their radios sputtering codes, and their hands lifting files from tables that had once hosted champagne flutes. Laptops were zipped into evidence bags, safes cracked with dull authority. Outside, unmarked vans lined the drive like hungry animals, swallowing crates of documents and hard drives. Officers moved with the efficiency of men who had prepared for months, but with the irreverence of those who enjoyed humbling giants. A junior inspector barked, "Bag this," while another whispered to a colleague, "Not today, Lagos, go chop gist." Madame Obiagu, queen of composure, tried to stand as her house became a market square of warrants. She rose, wrapper pulled taut, chin lifted with the poise of one who had stared down scandal before, but her knees betrayed her. When an officer unsealed the blue room credenza and lifted the brown phone with a gloved hand, reading aloud the log of calls with voices too expensive to belong to nobodies, Madame's composure fractured. She swayed, her palm flying to her chest as though truth had struck her there. For the first time since her widowhood, she looked small. "No," she murmured, staggering toward the banister. Her empire, her name polished like marble for decades, was being dragged into the harsh sun where even diamonds looked guilty. She collapsed onto the couch, a sound escaping her that was half groan, half prayer, the kind of noise that signals not pain of the body but the death of pride. Adaz, still barefaced, was seized gently but firmly. Two female officers guided her forward, her wrists bound with the plastic honesty of zip ties. She stumbled, her tears bright under the harsh lights. "I never meant this," she whispered, half to herself, half to anyone still willing to believe her. "I just wanted to live." Her sobs carried through the hall, haunting, the broken echoes of a dream that had promised salvation but delivered ruin. Her mask lay where it had fallen hours earlier, abandoned under a console, a prop from a play that had lost its audience. Amara stood in the center of the chaos, her bruises stiff with defiance, her voice clear as she gave testimony to the officers jotting furiously in notepads. She spoke of files, shell companies, regulators who ate bribes like Akara at dawn. She detailed the warehouse in Enugu, the phone calls, the threats. "You think you can intimidate me," one inspector warned softly, almost kindly, when he noticed her trembling hand. Amara steadied her voice. "If I survived their ropes, I can survive your threats." She signed her statement with a flourish, dignity refusing to die in ink, and then the empire began to collapse in real time. News alerts blazed across phones buzzing in pockets. Foreign investors withdraw from Obiagu Logistics. Oil giant cancels $200 million pipeline contract. Court orders freeze on accounts pending investigation. Journalists clustered outside the gates like vultures who had scented flesh. Reporters barked into cameras, their words carried live into living rooms where Lagosians, stirring pots of egusi or waiting in danfos, shook their heads with grim delight. "Obiagu Dynasty! Fall of the Mighty!" a headline screamed by evening. In the once proud hall, Chike knelt on the rug that had cost as much as a block of flats. He had not been pushed there by police. He had sunk there himself, knees giving way under the double weight of loss and revelation. The chandeliers mocked him with their unbothered glow. Around him, his empire's fragments lay scattered, files tagged as evidence, photographs turned to shame, the sound of boots claiming ownership of his sanctuary. His head hung forward, his hands limp on his thighs, eyes glazed with the disbelief of a man who had thought himself untouchable. He saw Amara in flickers, as if memory and presence had overlapped. Amara laughing in a taxi at his arrogance. Amara barefoot on Tarkwa Bay sand. Amara tonight, dusty and bruised, staring at him with a mixture of pity and fury that no boardroom could have prepared him for. Love lost and empire destroyed coiled together, two ghosts gnawing at his ribs. Amara approached slowly, her steps loud against the silence that had settled once the police moved to other rooms. She stood over him, arms crossed, her chest rising and falling as if her heart had been sprinting all day. She looked down and saw not the Titan Lagos had envied, but a broken man, shoulders bowed under the architecture of his own greed. Torn, she fought herself. One part of her wanted to kneel in comfort, to remind him of the boy who once told her grief was a thief. Another part wanted to spit, to ask if the villages poisoned by his negligence would also forgive, to ask if the children buried because of friendly regulators deserved a love story between them. Her silence pressed on him harder than any insult. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes, once bright with calculation and conquest, were hollow now, emptied of strategy, filled only with a nakedness that begged, without pride. His lips parted, cracked, hesitant. "Amara," he whispered, and the sound of her name in his voice was the most fragile it had ever been. He swallowed, and with the weight of a dynasty collapsed around them, he asked, "Can you still love me after this?" The question hung in the ruined hall, as officers shouted orders in distant rooms, as Madame Obiagu sobbed into her wrapper, as Adasi's cries faded down the driveway, leaving Amara to decide whether love could survive the ashes of corruption, betrayal, and a dynasty crumbling at her feet. Dawn pressed its pale forehead against the windows of the Obiagu mansion, and Amara understood that the sun could not decide for her. Either she would walk away into a morning that owed her nothing, or she would stay and try to build a future on the smoking foundation of a love that had lied. She stood in the bruised quiet of the hall where sirens had bullied sleep hours earlier, where the roses were finally wilting, as if they too were tired of pretending to be immortal. The marble had cooled under her bare feet, the air smelt of paper and sweat and the metallic aftertaste of handcuffs. She felt the skin on her wrists throb with the memory of rope, and realized her body had made its own record of the last month. Somewhere, a generator grumbled awake, as if to prove that even shame needs electricity. The house waited, listening the way a person listens after a loud argument, not for apology, but for the decision that must follow. She remembered tenderness the way you remember a favorite hymn after a long time. You do not trust the words anymore, but your mouth still knows the tune. Chike's crooked smile the night he confessed he feared losing her mind more than losing his money. His hand steadying her in a crowded market. The absurd joy of watching him struggle with the wrapper her aunties insisted he try on at a family gathering. And then the scars, the emails she had found, the cheerful criminality of friendly regulators, the rehearsed shock on his face that felt too much like a performance for the mirror, the mask, the masquerade, the empty seat where she should have been a bride. Memory is not fair. She had to hold both. She wondered if forgiveness was ever a singular act or a daily tax you pay to continue breathing near certain people. He came to her not like a titan, but like a man who had slept on the floor of his pride. The gold-threaded agbada had been replaced by a simple caftan, and fatigue had moved into his eyes as if it had paid 2 years' rent in advance. He did not try to touch her. He had learned at least that. "I will change," he said, voice low, paced like a man reciting the steps of his own rescue. "I will step down while they investigate. I have already called the board. I will rebuild clean if I am allowed to rebuild at all. We will pay what is owed. We will repair what we can. I will make restitution, not the kind that makes the news cycle smile. For a weekend, the kind that actually shifts weight off people's necks. Scholarships in the villages we burned in silence. Independent audits I don't get to edit. Unions that can say no without receiving midnight visitors. If my father's name is a house, let me remove the rot even if the roof must come down." He swallowed hard. "I want to be a man you do not have to argue into decency." The words were not nothing. They were heavy and human and cost him something to say. She wanted to hand him a future, as if futures could be passed like cups of water. But love is a witness, not a cover-up. "I believe you can change," she said, and he flinched because the sentence carried a clause he could hear but not amend. "But I cannot be the guarantor of that change. I cannot wake each day and wonder if I am married to a reform or to a relapse. I cannot build a home where my first duty is to explain my husband to my conscience." She held his gaze and saw him search her face for a loophole. There wasn't one. Across town, truth was learning its new address. In a concrete yard behind razor wire, Madame Obiagu sat on a low bench and wrote letters that began with endearments and ended with instructions. Her script, as elegant as her past, marching across prison-issue paper. She described herself as misunderstood, then as necessary, then as inevitable. Between those lines, the ink sometimes bled into bitterness. This is the price of being the only adult in a world of children who do not understand storms. She coached Chike in absentia, told him which allies would desert and which would pretend to desert while keeping a chair warm. She did not ask for forgiveness because she did not yet believe she had sinned. She asked for competence, for loyalty, for better lawyers. When lights out came and the cell learned its nightly humility, she lay awake replaying the courthouse steps of her youth, the years she'd vowed never again. The vow had kept its promise. The world had not. In another block, Adaiz traced her name with a thumbnail into the thin mattress seam and decided the past must be accounted for in full, not paid with the counterfeit of tears alone. She slept poorly the first week and then began to sleep as if she were in the hands of her new routine. Every dawn she woke with a sentence in her mouth: "Ambition is not a crime. The roots I took to feed it were." She convinced 2 wardresses to let her borrow a tattered dictionary and started a class under the neem tree in the yard, teaching 3 women the alphabet, drawing A's and B's in dust and saying the words aloud as if naming them could uncurse her choices. Sometimes she built a different life in her head, a tiny salon in Surulere, a signboard that read Adaizi and Daughters, the scissors whispering clean truths. She cried once, not for Chike's house or the masked jewelry, but for the girl at Ojulegba who had dreamed of a fence and a faithful mechanic. She promised the women, sitting cross-legged in front of her and herself, that the day the court called, she would stand and say everything she had done and everything she knew. If silence had bought her a costume, speech would be the only honest uniform she could wear now. If Aoma moved out of the mansion with 2 suitcases and a soft riot in her chest, she rented a modest upstairs room in Surulere where the neighbors fought with their generators and greeted one another with practicality. She planted a spider plant on the balcony not because she believed in luck, but because she had never kept anything alive that did not keep her alive back. She took a job with a nonprofit that trained market women on how to read contracts, taught them to say no to predatory microloans, and to demand receipts written in ink that didn't vanish with rain. On Saturdays, she sat on the floor with teenagers who had memorized the price of every gadget in Computer Village, but had never read the Consumer Protection Act. When she laughed now, it came from a place in her that hadn't been allowed to exist in the mansion, a laughter that did not seek permission from marble. She called her mother once a week and said little. "You do not speak to a fortress the way you speak to a person." Days melted forward. Lawyers calibrated tones. Newspapers learned new synonyms for fall. Chike spent hours with auditors whose eyes did not blink at titles, then with men in plain clothes who offered plea bargains as if they were weather reports. He sold a yacht he had never taught himself to love and donated the proceeds quietly to a clinic whose roof had been leaking into a maternity ward. He did not call a press conference. He sat with families by a river that had turned the wrong color and said sorry until it sounded like language again. He fired a man he had always feared and rehired another he had foolishly called naive. He ate without appetite and slept in a room that did not offer dreams, only accounting. For a moment, Lagos stopped pronouncing his name with awe and started pronouncing it with curiosity, and he decided curiosity was better company. But none of it bought Amara back. They met once more outside the courthouse, where light pooled at the steps as if justice could be coaxed by illumination. He came without entourage, hands in pockets, the city's smugness turned down low around them. "I will wait," he said, and she shook her head and smiled with the sadness of someone who had finally located the center of herself. "Don't," she replied. "Waiting turns women into furniture and men into statues. Move. If redemption is real, let it be real for its own sake, not because somebody is watching." She handed him a small envelope. Inside was the engagement ring he had chosen, delicate and expensive, now just a circle promising something she could not wear. Give it to the sea, she said, or to the church, or melt it into something useful. But not to me. On the last morning, Lagoes opened one eye and decided, for once, not to roar. The sky was a lighter blue than it had any right to be. At the park, the conductors negotiated destinations with their ordinary poetry. Ojulegba straight, Anthony, Yaba, enter quick, quick. And hawkers laced the air with gala and bottled hope. Amara arrived in flat shoes and a dress that did not announce itself. A scarf tied the way only practice perfects. She carried one small bag, the kind that doesn't insult the body, and a folder of papers she intended to file in another city where her name would not arrive before her. She bought a ticket with cash and a smile that asked nothing from the man behind the glass. Before boarding, she allowed herself a last look south in the direction of the island where marble had mistaken itself for destiny. She felt pity move through her. Pity for the woman in a cell who had arm-wrestled shame and won a Pyrrhic victory. For the girl in another block redeeming alphabets one dusted letter at a time. For the man who would spend years building a spine that could hold a soul as well as a company. Pity and something else. Release. She surprised herself by whispering, "Chukwu Dalu. Thank you for survival," and meant it. Then she turned toward the bus as if turning toward a door she had just built. Chike had not come to make a scene. He had sent a message the night before that said only, "I understand." Understanding, she had learned, was not a magic. It was a discipline. She climbed the steps, found a seat by the window. The conductor banged the metal. The engine coughed its familiar promise. The driver rubbed a small crucifix taped to the dashboard, as if favor were a fuel. The first warm wind of morning bulled through the window and laid a hand on her face the way a mother does when she doesn't know what else to offer. She leaned into it and let the city shrink to something she could carry. The rusted billboard, the girl balancing a tray of oranges like a crown, a policeman yawning into his duty. The bus lurched forward. Through the glass, the skyline gathered itself, not as a threat, not as a lover, simply as a city practicing its breathing. Third Mainland arced in the distance like a promise that could hold or break, depending on who drove. Amara closed her eyes and did not bargain with the day. Freedom is not applause. It is a road and a decision to walk it without commentary. She placed her palm on the folder in her lap, not to protect it, but to remind herself that even paper can become spine. As the bus eased into traffic, a man in a dark suit stepped away from a kiosk where he'd been pretending to read yesterday's paper. He watched the bus with the stillness of someone trained to memorize details, the number painted near the door, the conductor's cap cocked too far to the left, the shade of the scarf at the third window. His face was unremarkable on purpose. His shoes were forgettable by design. He slipped a phone from his pocket, dialed, and spoke in a calm that disrespected urgency. "She is boarded," he said. A pause, a faint nod. "Yes, alone." He ended the call, folded the newspaper he had not read, and began to walk, not fast, not showy, toward a black car idling with its air conditioner sighing secrets into the morning. And the bus rolled on, carrying a woman who had chosen freedom over jewelry, a city that would learn to pronounce her name without scandal, and a story that had not yet finished telling itself. The story may end here, but the questions remain. What would you have done if you were Amara? Walk away, or try to rebuild love in the ruins? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful Nigerian billionaire dramas, and hit the bell so you never miss the next twist. Your support keeps these stories alive.